Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've worked as a park ranger for over a decade, seen all kinds of things out here, lost hikers, dangerous wildlife, even the occasional storm that'd make you believe the sky was falling. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that evening near Mirror Lake. If you've ever been out in the backcountry, you know that sometimes the wild feels more alive than it should, like it's watching you. That day, I learned it wasn't just a feeling. It started as a routine check. Mirror Lake was one of the most secluded spots in the park, a hidden gem that few visitors even knew about. Most people who came here didn't venture beyond the usual trails, but those who did often camped by the lake for a few nights before disappearing back into civilization, peaceful, quiet, serene. That's how it had always been, at least until recently. I'd gotten a report earlier that week about some strange disturbances near the lake. Voices heard in the night, strange smells, and, most concerning, abandoned campsites. A pair of hikers had reported finding a campsite with all the gear left behind. The campfire still smoldering, but not a soul around. It wasn't unusual for people to panic and leave in a hurry. Bears, or even the sheer isolation, can do that to someone. But it was the second report in 2 weeks. And that's where my unease started to creep in. The day was overcast, clouds hanging low over the mountains as I hiked up the narrow, winding trail that led to the lake. It wasn't far from the ranger station, maybe a 2-hour trek, but the dense forest made it feel longer. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles, fresh and cold. I had my radio clipped to my belt, but reception was spotty out here, and by the time I reached the lake, I knew I'd be completely cut off. Mirror Lake wasn't big, more like a large pond, really, surrounded by towering trees that stretched to the sky like silent sentinels. The water was still, reflecting the dark clouds overhead in its glassy surface, giving the place an eerie, almost unreal feel. There wasn't a ripple in sight, not even from a fish. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the damp ground and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. As I approached the shoreline, I spotted the campsite, or what was left of it. The tent was still there, a bright orange dome standing out against the muted greens and browns of the forest. A fire pit sat nearby, filled with cold ash, but there were no signs of recent activity. No food scraps, no footprints, nothing. It was like whoever had been here had vanished into thin air. I crouched down by the tent, brushing aside some leaves to check for any clues. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint at first, but unmistakable, a sharp, metallic tang that hung in the air, like rusted iron or old blood. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees around me, but everything was still, too still. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I took a few cautious steps toward the water. Something wasn't right here. I'd been in these woods long enough to know when the silence was natural and when it wasn't. This wasn't natural. Just as I was about to turn back to the tent, I heard it, a low, distant growl, so deep I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I squinted, trying to make sense of the darkness between the trunks, but whatever it was had already slipped away. That's when I saw the tracks. Big, way too big to be human. They were pressed into the soft earth along the shoreline, leading away from the campsite and disappearing into the trees. Each print was deep, almost like whoever or whatever made them had been carrying a heavy weight. I knelt down to get a closer look, running my fingers over the edges of the tracks. Definitely not a bear. The shape was all wrong. But it wasn't human either. Something in my gut told me to leave. I'd seen enough weird stuff over the years to trust my instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But my training kicked in, and I knew I couldn't just walk away without at least trying to figure out what had happened to the campers. I stood up, my eyes scanning the tree line again. The wind had picked up, sending a chill through the air, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, like it was closing off any escape routes. I swallowed hard and reached for my radio. But as expected, there was no signal. I was on my own. I decided to follow the tracks, but I kept my hand on the bear spray clipped to my belt. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better as I moved deeper into the woods, the tracks leading me farther from the lake. The further I went, the denser the trees became, their branches intertwining overhead until they blocked out most of the remaining light. It was like stepping into another world, a world where the rules of nature didn't apply. I followed the tracks for what felt like miles, though it was probably only a few hundred yards. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, roots and rocks hidden beneath layers of moss and fallen leaves. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as the air grew colder, and the smell, that sharp metallic stench, grew stronger. Then I heard it again. The growl, but this time it was closer. Too close. I spun around, my eyes darting between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. My heart was racing now, my pulse hammering in my throat as the forest seemed to close in around me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was watching me, hunting me. Without thinking, I backed away, trying to retrace my steps. But the ground felt unfamiliar now, like I'd wandered too far from the trail. The tracks were gone, swallowed by the thick underbrush, and the trees pressed in tighter. My hands were shaking, but I kept my grip on the bear spray, ready to use it if whatever was out there made a move. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, branches snapping, leaves rustling, something massive moving through the forest. I took a step back, then another, my eyes locked on the shadows ahead. And then I saw it, just for a split second, through the gaps in the trees, something tall, impossibly tall, with dark, matted fur and eyes that seemed to glow in the fading light. It moved like a predator, silent and deliberate, its gaze fixed on me. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a bear or a mountain lion or anything else I could explain. This was something else, something I wasn't prepared to deal with. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the tracks anymore, or the missing campers, or the fact that I was completely lost. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, and fast. My boots pounded against the ground as I weaved between the trees, branches slashing at my face and arms as I sprinted through the underbrush. The sound of footsteps followed me, heavy and fast, growing louder with every second. I wasn't going to make it. My chest burned as I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled, nearly falling before catching myself on a tree. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath. The lake was ahead of me, its surface still and dark, but there was no time to stop. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature charging after me, but the forest was still, quiet, too quiet. I slowed down, my breath ragged as I reached the edge of the lake. The campsite was just ahead, the bright orange tent still standing against the backdrop of the dark trees, but something was wrong. The air felt heavier now, thick with tension, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then I saw them, the campers. They were standing by the water's edge, their backs to me, completely still. Story 2. I never believed in monsters until that night in the forest. Now, I'm not so sure what's real anymore. My name's Sarah, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest for the past 5 years. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, every trail, every hidden glade, every animal call. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonless October night. It started like any other graveyard shift. I was making my usual rounds, checking on the campgrounds, and keeping an eye out for any rule breakers or lost hikers. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. Around midnight, I heard it. A low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. At first, I dismissed it as a bear or maybe a couple of coyotes, but as I listened closer, I realized it was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was too deep for a wolf, too rhythmic for a cougar. Whatever was making that noise was big and it was close. I radioed back to base, keeping my voice low. "This is Ranger Collins. I'm hearing some strange noises near the old fire tower. Going to investigate. Over." "Copy that, Sarah. Be careful out there. Let us know if you need backup." I clicked off the radio and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. As I moved deeper into the forest, the undergrowth became thicker, branches clawing at my uniform. The beam of my flashlight seemed to grow weaker with each step, as if the darkness itself was pushing back against the intrusion. That's when I saw them. Footprints. But not like any I'd seen before. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. And the shape was all wrong, too elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edge of one print. It was fresh, the soil still damp and loose. A twig snapped somewhere to my left, and I whirled around, my hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt. The forest had gone eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the pounding of blood in my ears. I stood slowly, every muscle in my body tense. That's when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. You know that prickle on the back of your neck, the one that tells you something's not right. It was like that, but 100 times stronger. Whatever was out there, it was studying me, sizing me up. Another growl rumbled through the trees, closer this time, much closer. I swung my flashlight in a wide arc, searching desperately for the source. The beam caught something for just a split second, a flash of eyes reflecting in the darkness. They were set high off the ground, much higher than any animal I knew should be. My training kicked in, and I started to back away slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Hey there," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't want any trouble, I'm just passing through." No response, but I could hear something large moving through the underbrush, circling around me. The snapping of branches and the rustle of leaves seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the night. I fumbled for my radio, never taking my eyes off the spot where I'd seen those eyes. "Base, this is Collins. I need backup at my location." Now, static crackled back at me. Of course, the old fire tower always played havoc with our radio signals. I was on my own. That's when it stepped into view, and my world turned upside down. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a broad, powerful build. Thick, dark fur covered its body, matted in places with what looked horribly like dried blood. But it was the face that haunted me, a twisted mix of human and animal features, with a protruding snout and teeth that gleamed wickedly in the beam of my flashlight. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I could see intelligence in those eyes, a cold calculation that was far more terrifying than mere animal hunger. It tilted its head, studying me with an almost curious expression. Then it let out a roar that shook me to my very core. The sound was primal, a declaration of dominance that left no doubt about who was the apex predator in these woods. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. All my training, all my experience, it meant nothing in that moment. Pure, animal instinct took over, and I ran faster than I ever had in my life. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind me, gaining ground with every second. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on. I had to get back to the ranger station, back to safety and backup and things that made sense. The trees began to thin out, and I could see the lights of the parking lot ahead, just a little further. Something grabbed my ankle, and I went down hard. The breath knocked out of me as I hit the ground. I rolled over, kicking frantically, my hand scrambling for the bear spray. The creature loomed over me, its hot breath washing over my face as it leaned in close. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the end, but it never came. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to look. The thing was gone, melted back into the shadows of the forest as if it had never been there at all. I lay there for a long time, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. When I finally managed to stand, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. I made it back to the station somehow, collapsing into a chair as my colleagues rushed to help me. I told them everything, of course. They searched the area, but found nothing conclusive. No giant footprints, no signs of any large predator. Just some broken branches and disturbed undergrowth that could have been caused by anything. The official report chalked it up to a bear encounter and my own overactive imagination. But I know what I saw that night. I know it was real, as surely as I know the sun will rise tomorrow. And I know it's still out there, watching and waiting in the dark heart of the forest. I still work as a ranger. These woods are my home, and I won't be chased away. But I never go out on patrol alone anymore, especially at night. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that growl again, calling out from the depths of the forest. A reminder that there are some things in this world that defy explanation. Some creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of what we think we know. So, if you ever find yourself in Blackwood National Forest, stick to the marked trails. Don't wander off alone. And if you hear something strange in the night, something that makes your hair stand on end and your heart race, don't investigate. Just run. Run. And don't look back. Because you never know what might be watching you from the shadows. Story 3. There are certain sounds in nature that don't belong. You can spend years hiking, camping, and navigating the wild, and you'll become familiar with its rhythm. The wind rustling through the trees, the distant call of an owl, or the snap of a branch underfoot. These are sounds you come to expect. But every once in a while, you hear something that makes your blood run cold, something that doesn't belong. That night in the Appalachians, we heard that sound. Mike and I had been hiking for 3 days, exploring the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Appalachian Trail was usually well-traveled, but we'd chosen a lesser-known spur that veered off into more secluded territory. The trail was tougher, the woods thicker, and we hadn't seen another soul since we set out. That's exactly how we liked it. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, and a chill settled over the forest. We'd set up camp near a stream, its gentle burbling the only sound in the growing darkness. The fire crackled in front of us, casting flickering shadows on the trees, and we sat in companionable silence, sipping on instant coffee from tin mugs. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you can only find in the middle of nowhere, far from the noise and chaos of the world. I stretched my legs out, feeling the ache from the day's hike. Mike was poking at the fire, a thoughtful look on his face. He wasn't much of a talker, but neither was I. That's why we got along so well. It wasn't until later, long after the sun had set and the fire had burned low, that we heard it. At first, it was faint, almost like a distant animal call, but it didn't sound right. It was high-pitched, piercing, like the cry of something in pain, and it carried on the wind, rising and falling in unnatural waves. I froze, my mug halfway to my lips, and shot a glance at Mike. He had gone completely still, his hand hovering over the firewood. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice low. Mike shook his head slowly, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but it didn't sound good." We sat there for a moment, straining to hear, but the woods had gone silent. Even the stream seemed quieter now, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to brush it off, though the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. But the scream came again, louder this time, closer. I shot to my feet, my heart pounding. There was something about that sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It wasn't just a scream, it was a cry for help. A human cry. "Someone's out there," I muttered. Mike stood up beside me, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the campfire's glow. "Maybe, or maybe it's something we don't want to find." "We can't just ignore it," I said, grabbing my flashlight and clicking it on. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the trees in sharp relief, but the woods felt bigger somehow, more menacing. "What if someone's hurt?" Mike hesitated, then sighed. "All right, but we stick close. If it's some hiker lost out here, they won't be far." The scream came again, cutting through the air like a knife. It seemed to echo all around us, bouncing off the trees, making it hard to pinpoint where it was coming from. We grabbed our gear, just the essentials, a knife for each of us, and my flashlight, and stepped away from the warmth of the fire. As soon as we left the circle of light, the cold closed in, wrapping around us like a shroud. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together in a tangled canopy, and the ground was uneven beneath our boots. Every step felt wrong. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animal sounds, just silence and the occasional crunch of our boots on the dead leaves and twigs. The beam of my flashlight swept across the trunks of the trees, casting long, distorted shadows that flickered at the edges of my vision. I tried not to look too closely. It was easy to see shapes where there were none. Easy to let your mind play tricks on you out here. Mike was right behind me, his face set in a grim expression, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something to leap out of the darkness. Neither of us spoke. The air was thick with tension, and we both knew we were heading towards something we might not want to find. Another scream ripped through the night, this one so close it made my heart jump into my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening. It was close now, so close I swore I could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. "Over there," Mike whispered, pointing to the left, where the trees were thicker. "It's coming from that direction." I nodded and we started moving again, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dense foliage. The scream came again, but it was different this time, shorter, more frantic, desperate. We were close. But then, as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped. I froze, my flashlight beam hovering over a patch of dense underbrush. The silence was deafening. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, nothing but the sound of my own breathing, sharp and ragged in my ears. "Where did it go?" I muttered under my breath. Mike stepped up beside me, his face pale in the dim light. "Maybe we scared it off. Or maybe we got too close." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. There was something about the quiet that unnerved me more than the scream itself. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I shone the flashlight around, sweeping it from tree to tree, but there was no sign of anything, no movement, no tracks, no blood, just trees and shadows. For a moment, I thought maybe we'd imagined it all, but then I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. "Mike," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Look." He turned to where I was pointing, and we both saw it at the same time. At first, I couldn't quite make sense of it. There, tangled in the branches of a low tree, was something hanging, a shape, limp and lifeless. It was small, smaller than I expected, and as I moved closer, the light caught it fully. It was a deer, a young one, its body twisted and broken, hanging from the branches like a grotesque ornament. Its eyes were wide open, glazed over with death, and its mouth was open in a silent scream. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the way it had been torn apart. Something had gutted it, clean and precise, leaving its entrails hanging from the branches like some kind of gruesome offering. Blood dripped slowly from its body, pooling on the ground below in dark, wet patches. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to turn away. "What the hell did this?" Mike's voice was low, barely a whisper. I shook my head, swallowing hard. "I don't know, but it wasn't a bear." We stood there for a moment, frozen in place, staring at the mutilated deer. The flashlight beam wavered in my hand, and I realized my fingers were trembling. And then, out of the silence, came the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was the same scream we'd heard before, but this time it wasn't distant, it wasn't muffled. It was right there, right behind us. I spun around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly as I searched the darkness. But there was nothing. Just trees and shadows and the cold, suffocating silence. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to run, to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. "Mike," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We need to go." He nodded, his eyes wide with fear, but as we turned to leave, the underbrush ahead of us exploded with movement. Something massive, something fast, charged through the trees, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls filling the air. We ran. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We ran like our lives depended on it, because in that moment, I knew they did. The screams followed us, echoing through the forest, growing louder and closer with every step. We didn't stop running until we reached the campfire. The silence fell once again, thick and heavy, as if whatever had been chasing us had let us go. But deep down, I knew it hadn't. Something was still out there, and it was waiting. Story 4. I used to think the scariest thing in the wilderness was getting lost. Now I know better. Sometimes it's what finds you that you should really fear. My name's Mike, and I've been an avid solo camper for years. There's nothing I love more than getting away from it all, just me and nature. But after what happened last summer in the Cascade Mountains, I'm not sure I'll ever camp alone again. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trek, a chance to clear my head and test out some new gear. I'd chosen a remote area, well off the beaten path. The kind of place where you can go days without seeing another soul. In hindsight, maybe that wasn't the smartest idea. The first day went smoothly. I hiked deep into the backcountry, setting up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. As the sun began to set, I got a fire going and settled in with a freeze-dried meal and a paperback. The night was clear, stars twinkling overhead like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Perfect camping weather. It was on the second day that things started to get weird. I'd spent the morning exploring, taking photos of the landscape and jotting notes in my journal. Around midday, I decided to climb a nearby ridge to get a better view of the valley. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but as I focused my binoculars, I realized this was something else entirely. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, covered in dark, shaggy fur, but it wasn't the size that unnerved me. It was the way it moved. Bipedal, almost human-like, but with a fluidity that no person could match. I watched, frozen in place, as the creature loped across a meadow below, disappearing into the tree line on the other side. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. A bear. No, the proportions were all wrong. A person in a costume. Out here, miles from civilization. It didn't make sense. I made my way back to camp, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming before, now felt oppressive. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. As night fell, I debated packing up and hiking out, but the thought of stumbling through the dark woods, potentially running into whatever that thing was, seemed even more dangerous. So I stayed put, zipping myself into my tent and clutching my hunting knife like a child with a security blanket. Sleep was impossible. Every sound outside seemed amplified. The hoot of an owl, the scurrying of small animals, the wind whistling through the trees, and then I heard it, heavy footsteps circling the campsite, slow, deliberate, like something big trying to move quietly. My heart pounded so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I lay there, barely breathing, as the footsteps drew closer to my tent. A shadow fell across the fabric, massive and hunched. I could hear deep, ragged breathing, smell a musky, animal odor. For what felt like hours, the creature prowled around my tent. Occasionally, it would pause, and I swear I could feel its gaze penetrating the thin nylon, searching for me. I didn't move a muscle, didn't make a sound, just silently prayed for dawn to come. Eventually, the footsteps receded, and the forest fell silent once more. But I didn't relax, didn't let my guard down for a second. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, straining my ears for any sign of the thing's return. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I cautiously unzipped my tent and peered out. The campsite looked undisturbed, but as I stepped outside, I saw them, footprints, huge, humanoid prints circling my tent, pressed deep into the soft earth. And there, caught on a nearby branch, a tuft of coarse, dark hair. I've never packed up camp so fast in my life. I was on the trail within minutes, pushing myself hard to get back to civilization. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow between the trees had me jumping. I half expected to see that hulking figure emerge from behind a boulder or step out from behind a tree trunk. It wasn't until I reached my car, safely parked at the trailhead, that I allowed myself to relax. As I drove home, my mind whirled with questions. What had I seen out there? Some undiscovered species? A creature that shouldn't exist? Or had fear and isolation played tricks on my mind? I've spent months researching since then, poring over cryptozoology websites and local legends. I've heard whispers of similar encounters, hikers and campers reporting glimpses of large, ape-like creatures in remote areas. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I used to scoff at those stories. Now, I'm not so sure. I still go camping, but never alone, and never in that part of the mountains. Sometimes, when I'm sitting around a campfire with friends, I think about sharing my story, but I always hold back. How do you tell people that the monsters from campfire tales might be real, that there are things in the wilderness that defy explanation? So I keep it to myself, this secret knowledge that the world is stranger and more mysterious than most people realize. But I'm always watching the tree line now, always listening for heavy footsteps in the night, because once you've glimpsed what's hiding in the shadows, you can never truly feel safe in the wild again. If you're planning a camping trip, especially in remote areas, stay alert. Stick with a group if you can. And if you see something out there, something that doesn't quite fit, don't investigate. Don't try to get a closer look. Just get out of there as fast as you can. Because sometimes curiosity isn't just dangerous, it can be deadly. As for me, I'm done with solo adventures. These days, I stick to well-traveled trails and popular campgrounds. It might not be as exciting, but at least I can sleep at night without wondering what's lurking just beyond the glow of my campfire. But even now, months later, I still have nightmares about that night. The shadow looming over my tent, the heavy breathing, the feeling of being watched by something ancient and powerful, and sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear a low, rumbling growl echoing from the distant mountains. A reminder that there are still wild places in this world, and wild things that call them home. So the next time you're in the great outdoors, and you get that prickly feeling on the back of your neck, like you're being watched, pay attention, because maybe, just maybe, you are. And whatever's doing the watching might be something science hasn't explained yet, something that doesn't officially exist. Just remember, not all monsters hide under the bed. Some of them are out there in the woods, waiting for unwary campers to stumble into their territory. Stay safe, stay alert, and maybe think twice before heading off into the wilderness alone, because you never know what might be waiting for you out there in the dark. Story 5. They say there's nothing like the quiet of a Montana night, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world has stopped turning, like you're the only person left on Earth. It's a peace I used to take comfort in, something I'd learned to love after years of living out here. But recently, the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. And in that silence, something was watching. I first noticed something was off about 2 weeks ago. I'd been running my cattle ranch for over a decade. And while you get the occasional predator out here, wolves, coyotes, the odd bear, it's nothing you can't handle with good fencing and a rifle close by. But this was different. It started with a couple of cows disappearing, just vanishing without a trace. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no carcasses left behind. It was like they'd been plucked right off the land. At first, I chalked it up to a thief. Maybe some rustlers sneaking in during the night, but even that didn't make sense. The ranch is remote, miles from the nearest town, and the cattle aren't easy to move without causing a racket. Still, I kept an eye out, locking up the barn tight at night and taking the rifle with me whenever I checked the pastures. It didn't stop the disappearances, and then the tracks started. I found the first set near the north fence. Big, deep prints, too big to belong to any animal I knew. Definitely not a bear. These were long, with distinct claw marks that dug into the dirt. I knelt down to inspect them, running my hand along the edge of one print, and a chill crept down my spine. Whatever made these was heavy, heavier than anything that should be roaming around out here. That's when I started to feel it, the sensation of being watched. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just nerves from the cattle going missing and the weird tracks. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every time I was outside, whether I was checking the fences or feeding the animals, I'd get that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like eyes boring into me from the tree line. I mentioned it to my neighbor, Roy, when I saw him in town a few days later. Roy's been around longer than I have, born and raised in these parts, and he just gave me this long, hard look when I told him about the tracks. "You ever hear stories about the shadows in these woods?" he asked, his voice low. I frowned. "What kind of stories?" Roy shrugged, but his eyes stayed serious. "Just old tales. Things people used to talk about around campfires. They say there's things out here that ain't quite natural. Things that come down from the mountains when the nights get long." I laughed it off at the time, figuring Roy was just trying to spook me, but deep down, his words stuck with me, and when the sun set that night and I stood out by the barn with my rifle in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was something more to those old campfire stories. It was just after midnight when I heard it. A low, deep growl, rolling out from the darkness like a rumble of distant thunder. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I gripped the rifle tighter. The sound was close. Too close. It was coming from the direction of the north pasture. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, listening. The growl came again, softer this time, like whatever was out there was pacing just beyond the reach of the barn lights. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to take a step toward the fence. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the tall grass and the silhouettes of the trees beyond. Nothing. But the growl didn't stop. It seemed to follow me as I walked along the fence, its rhythm steady like it was testing me. I shone the flashlight toward the tree line, and that's when I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing in the shadows. They were high off the ground, too high to belong to any normal animal. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I was frozen in place, the beam of the flashlight locked on those eyes. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared right back at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I raised the rifle, but before I could even take aim, the eyes vanished. The growl stopped, and the night was silent again. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the darkness, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I lowered the rifle and backed away, my pulse still racing. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't sleep much at all after that. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. I kept checking the pastures, checking the fences, but everything seemed normal. No more missing cattle, no strange tracks. It was almost like whatever had been out there had decided to leave me alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that it was just waiting, and I was right. It was a week later when things escalated. I was out fixing the south fence when I noticed something strange. The ground around one of the fence posts was disturbed, like something had been digging. At first, I thought it was just a coyote or maybe a badger, but then I saw the prints. The same deep-clawed tracks I'd seen before, but this time there were more of them. They circled the fence post and then led off into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, the pit in my stomach growing heavier with each passing second. Whatever this was, it wasn't afraid of me. It wasn't afraid of my land, and it sure as hell wasn't done with me yet. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for whatever it was to come for me. I was going to confront it. I grabbed my rifle, slung a flashlight around my neck, and set out for the north pasture, the place where I'd seen the eyes, where I'd felt it watching. The walk felt longer than usual, every shadow stretching out before me, every rustle of the wind sounding like footsteps. I tried to keep my breathing steady, tried to focus on the crunch of the dirt under my boots, but the further I walked, the more I felt like I was walking into a trap. When I reached the pasture, the moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the land. The cattle were huddled together, uneasy, their eyes flicking toward the tree line. I shone my flashlight over them, and that's when I saw the first movement, a shadow darting between the trees. I swung the beam toward it, but it was gone before I could get a good look. My heart was hammering in my chest now, but I kept walking, moving closer to the edge of the woods. The growl came again, low and guttural, vibrating through the ground. I raised the rifle, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. It was big, taller than any man I'd ever seen, its body covered in thick, matted fur. It moved with an unnatural grace, its long arms swaying at its sides as it stepped out from behind a tree. The moonlight caught its face, and for a split second I saw its eyes, those same glowing eyes I'd seen before. Cold, calculating, hungry. I didn't think. I just fired. The shot echoed through the night, and the creature let out a roar that shook the trees. It didn't fall. Instead, it lunged toward me, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. I stumbled backward, trying to get another shot off, but it was already too close. My flashlight hit the ground, the beam flickering as I scrambled to my feet. The creature was gone, disappearing into the woods like a ghost. The silence returned, but this time it was suffocating, wrapping around me like a noose. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for a long time after that. The disappearances stopped after that encounter, but I knew it wasn't because the creature was gone. It was still out there, watching, waiting. It had let me live that night, but I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was just toying with me. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. The shadows in these woods were alive, and they weren't done with me yet. Story 6. I always thought I was alone on my hikes, until the day I realized something was hunting me. My name is Emily, and I've been an avid hiker for as long as I can remember. The solitude, the connection with nature, the physical challenge. It's always been my escape from the chaos of everyday life, but after what happened on the Whispering Pines Trail last fall, I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe in the woods again. It was a crisp October morning when I set out. The trail was a new one for me, reputed to be challenging but rewarding, with stunning views of the valley below. I'd packed light, just water, some energy bars, and my trusty hiking poles. The weather report promised clear skies, perfect for a day-long trek. The first few hours were everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas. The fall colors were at their peak, painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. I stopped often to take photos, marveling at the beauty around me. It was just after noon when things started to feel off. I'd reached a particularly remote stretch of the trail, where the trees grew close and gnarled, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air felt heavier here, almost oppressive, and it was quiet, too quiet. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. I picked up my pace, eager to get through this section and back into more open terrain. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, expecting to see a deer or maybe a fox. What I saw instead froze the blood in my veins. Standing at the edge of the trail, partially obscured by a large oak, was something. At first glance it looked like an enormous dog, easily the size of a bear, but it was standing on its hind legs, its posture unnaturally erect. Its fur was a mottled grey-brown, matted and wild, but it was the eyes that truly terrified me, intelligent, almost human-like, and fixed directly on me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that was the worst thing I could do. So I stood my ground, trying to appear larger than I was, my hand inching towards the bear spray on my belt. The creature tilted its head, studying me with an almost curious expression. Then, without warning, it dropped to all fours and loped off into the underbrush, moving with a speed and grace that defied its size. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned and started walking, not running, I knew better than that, but moving as quickly as I dared along the narrow trail. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. A bear? No, the shape was all wrong. A wolf? Impossible. It was far too large. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. I needed to get off this trail and back to civilization as soon as possible. As I walked, I became acutely aware of my surroundings. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me on high alert. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now felt oppressive and threatening. Shadows seemed to move between the trees, and more than once I caught glimpses of something large keeping pace with me just out of clear sight. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. It was constant, unrelenting. I could feel eyes on me, studying my every move. Occasionally, I'd hear a low growl or the sound of heavy breathing, always just behind me or off to the side, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. As the afternoon wore on, my panic grew. The trail seemed endless, each turn revealing only more forest stretching out ahead. My water was running low, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to my car before nightfall. The thought of being in these woods after dark, with that thing out there, was almost too much to bear. Just as despair was starting to set in, I heard it, the sound of rushing water. A river. The map had shown a river cutting across the trail about 3/4 of the way through. If I could reach it, I'd know exactly where I was. More importantly, I could follow it downstream to a ranger station I'd seen marked on the map. Renewed hope gave me a burst of energy, and I pushed on faster. The sound grew louder, and finally I broke through the tree line to see the river ahead, its waters churning over rocks and fallen logs. Relief flooded through me until I heard the growl, low, menacing, and terrifyingly close. I spun around to see the creature emerging from the shadows of the forest. In the fading daylight, it looked even more monstrous than before. Saliva dripped from its jaws, and its eyes gleamed with predatory intent. In that moment, all thoughts of standing my ground vanished. I ran. I sprinted along the riverbank, my legs burning with effort, my lungs screaming for air. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls and ragged breathing growing closer with each second. Ahead, I saw a fallen tree spanning the river. Without hesitation, I leaped onto it, using my hiking poles for balance as I scrambled across. The log shifted and groaned under my weight, threatening to give way at any moment. Just as I reached the other side, I heard a tremendous splash. I risked a glance back to see the creature thrashing in the water, carried downstream by the swift current. It let out a howl of frustration that echoed through the valley, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for months to come. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station, nearly an hour later. By then, night had fallen, and I was exhausted, dehydrated, and on the verge of hysteria. The rangers were skeptical of my story, of course. They searched the area but found no sign of any large predator. The official report chalked it up to an encounter with a black bear and my own overactive imagination, but I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a bear, or a wolf, or any other known animal. Whatever it was something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. I still hike, but never alone, and never on remote trails. I stick to popular paths, always in a group, always hyper-aware of my surroundings, because now I know the truth, that there are things out there in the wilderness that we can't explain, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. So if you're planning a hike, especially in areas known for strange sightings or unexplained disappearances, be careful, stay alert, and if you get that feeling of being watched, if you hear something moving in the underbrush that sounds too big to be normal wildlife, don't investigate, don't try to be brave, just get out of there as fast as you can. Because sometimes the trail leads to places we're not meant to go, and sometimes the things we find there are better left undiscovered. The wilderness is beautiful, yes, but it's also wild and unpredictable. And in its darkest corners, there may be monsters waiting that are all too real. As for me, I'll never forget that day on the Whispering Pines Trail. The memory of those eyes, that howl, the sheer impossibility of what I encountered, it's always with me. A reminder that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we like to believe, and that sometimes, when we venture into nature's domain, we might find ourselves face to face with something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the world around us. Story 7. There's something about the silence of the Alaskan wilderness in winter that gets under your skin. It's not like the silence you find in a city at night, or even in the forests back home. This silence is deeper, primal, almost. Out here, when the snow falls thick and the wind dies down, it's like the world is holding its breath. And in that silence, every little noise feels like a warning. I'd been a park ranger in Alaska for about 5 years by the time this happened. I'd seen my share of strange things, but nothing could have prepared me for what went down that winter. It was the middle of January, and I had been assigned to patrol a remote stretch of land deep within the Denali National Park, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person, and where the cold would bite right through your clothes if you weren't careful. I loved it, though, the isolation, the raw beauty of the land, the sense of freedom. There was something about being out there, just me and the wilderness, that made me feel alive. But that feeling changed when I found the tracks. I had set out early that morning, trudging through the knee-deep snow with my snowshoes strapped on tight. The sky was a dull grey, the kind of overcast that hangs low and heavy, making it impossible to tell what time of day it is. The wind was still, and the only sound was the crunch of snow under my boots. My breath fogged in front of me, hanging in the frigid air before disappearing into the cold. I was about 5 miles into my patrol when I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The snow was fresh, had fallen the night before, and there, just ahead of me, were tracks, huge ones. They stood out against the unbroken whiteness, each one at least twice the size of my boot, with deep indentations where whatever made them had stepped hard into the snow. I stopped in my tracks, staring down at them. Bear, I thought at first. It had to be a bear. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't right. The shape was all wrong. Bears leave wide, flat tracks with distinctive claw marks. But these were long, narrow, almost human in shape, except for the size and the fact that the toes seemed to end in sharp, deep points. I knelt down, reaching out to brush my gloved fingers over the edge of one of the prints. The snow around it was packed down tight, like whatever made it was heavy. My stomach twisted with unease as I looked at the direction the tracks were leading, straight into the trees, toward the dense forest ahead. I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line. There was no movement, no sound, nothing but the oppressive silence of the wilderness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I should have turned back right then. Radioed it in. Let someone else investigate. But that's not how we do things out here. When you're a ranger in the middle of nowhere, you handle things yourself. I started following the tracks. They led me deeper into the woods, winding through the trees in a way that felt deliberate. Almost like whatever I was tracking knew exactly where it was going. The snow was deeper here, but the tracks were still clear, each step leaving a deep imprint in the snow. I kept my eyes forward, scanning the forest ahead, but there was no sign of movement, just the tracks, and the unnerving sense that I wasn't alone. After about an hour, I came to a small clearing, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tracks, there were more of them now, at least 2, maybe 3 sets, crisscrossing through the clearing. They all looked the same, huge, clawed footprints, moving in different directions, like whatever had made them had been circling, pacing, and they were fresh. I knelt down again, inspecting the edges of the tracks. They hadn't been here long, maybe an hour at most, which meant whatever had made them was close, too close. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I was miles away from the nearest outpost, with no radio signal and no backup. The snow around me suddenly felt heavier. The trees closing in like they were watching me. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me, and I knew I needed to leave. Now. I turned and started back the way I came, moving faster than I had before, my boots crunching in the snow, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. But as I retraced my steps, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The tracks I had been following, they weren't the only ones anymore. Next to my own prints in the snow were more of those massive footprints, and they were following me. I glanced over my shoulder, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing, just trees and snow. But the tracks were unmistakable. Something had been walking behind me, following me as I made my way through the woods, and it was close. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind had picked up now, whistling through the trees, and the sky had darkened, the grey clouds thickening as snow began to fall. I was moving fast, but the tracks were keeping pace, their presence a constant, gnawing reminder that I wasn't alone. I was being hunted. As I hurried through the forest, the trees seemed to blur around me, the snow falling faster and thicker, obscuring my vision. My breath came in ragged gasps, fogging in the cold air, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me harder with every step. That's when I heard it. A low, deep growl echoing through the trees. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But it was there, unmistakable, vibrating through the air like a distant rumble of thunder. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood turning to ice. The growl came again, closer this time, and I realized with a sickening certainty that whatever was following me was no longer content to stay hidden. It was coming for me. Without thinking, I broke into a run. My boots pounded through the snow, slipping and sliding as I tore through the trees, the wind howling in my ears. The growling was getting louder now, closer, and I could hear the heavy crunch of footsteps behind me, footsteps that didn't belong to me. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like an eternity. My lungs were burning, my legs screaming in protest as I pushed myself harder, faster. The snow was falling in thick sheets now, blinding me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, up ahead, I saw it, the outpost. A small wooden cabin, barely visible through the storm. My heart leapt into my throat as I sprinted toward it, the footsteps behind me growing louder, closer. I threw myself against the door, fumbling with the latch, my fingers numb from the cold. The growling was right behind me now, so close I could feel the vibrations in the air. I shoved the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me just as something massive crashed into it from the other side. The whole cabin shook, the door rattling on its hinges. I pressed my back against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. The growling outside was deafening now, a deep, guttural sound that made the walls tremble. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I stayed there, pressed against the door, for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. But there was nothing. No growl, no footsteps, just the sound of the wind howling outside and the faint crackling of the wood stove in the corner. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't dare leave the cabin. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was a pale, icy blue. I looked down at the ground in front of the cabin, my breath catching in my throat. The tracks were gone, but the feeling of being watched, that would stay with me forever. Story 8. I've been a hunter all my life, but that night in the forest, I became the hunted. My name's John, and I've been tracking game through these woods since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I thought I knew every inch of this forest, every animal call, every trick of light and shadow. But what I encountered on that crisp autumn night shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was the first day of deer season, and I'd set out before dawn, eager to bag the first buck of the year. The air was cool and crisp, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I made my way to my favorite hunting spot, a sturdy old oak with a perfect view of a small clearing where deer often came to graze. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I settled into my tree stand, my trusted rifle at the ready. Hours passed, the forest slowly coming to life around me. Squirrels chattered, birds called, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. But no deer. It was nearing midday when I decided to do a bit of scouting. I climbed down from my perch and began to make my way through the underbrush, eyes peeled for signs of deer activity. That's when I found it, the carcass. At first glance, I thought it was just another deer killed by coyotes or maybe a mountain lion. But as I got closer, I realized something was off, the way it had been torn apart. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. The wounds were too large, too savage, and there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. The deer's antlers had been deliberately snapped off, like some kind of trophy. I knelt down to examine the tracks around the carcass, and my blood ran cold. These weren't coyote prints, or bear, or anything else I recognized. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. And they were fresh. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and I whirled around, my rifle at the ready. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar, wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural, almost human, but not quite. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but years of hunting experience kept me rooted to the spot. Running would only trigger a predator's chase response. So I stood my ground, scanning the tree line, my finger resting lightly on the trigger of my rifle. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something large and dark slipping between the trees, moving with a fluidity that belied its size. I caught a glimpse of shaggy fur, of eyes that reflected the midday sun like polished coins. I raised my rifle, tracking the movement, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Sweat trickled down my back despite the cool air. I knew I needed to get out of there, to get back to my truck and off this mountain. But my tree stand was in the opposite direction of where I'd seen the creature. I'd have to pass right by where it had disappeared into the underbrush. Taking a deep breath, I started to move, each step careful and deliberate. I kept my rifle ready, my eyes constantly scanning my surroundings. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots and my own ragged breathing. I was about halfway back to my stand when I heard it again, that deep, rumbling growl, closer this time, much closer. I spun around, and there it was, standing at the edge of the clearing I'd just left. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a broad, powerful build. Dark, matted fur covered its body and its face. God, its face. It was like a twisted parody of a human face, with a protruding snout and teeth that gleamed wickedly in the midday sun. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I could see intelligence in those eyes, a cold calculation that chilled me to the bone. It tilted its head, studying me with an almost curious expression. Then it let out a roar that shook the very air around us, a sound of pure, primal rage that sent birds scattering from the treetops. And it charged. I didn't think, I just reacted. I raised my rifle and fired, the report deafening in the quiet forest. The creature stumbled, letting out a bellow of pain and fury, but it didn't go down. Instead, it seemed to grow even more enraged, barreling towards me with terrifying speed. I turned and ran, all thoughts of standing my ground forgotten. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear it behind me, gaining ground with every second. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I could see my tree stand ahead, the ladder leading up to safety, if I could just reach it. Something swiped at my back, and I felt a searing pain as claws raked across my shoulder. I stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to keep my feet under me. The tree was right there, just a few more steps. I hit the ladder at full speed, scrambling up it with desperate strength. I could feel hot breath on my heels, hear the snapping of jaws just inches from my boots. But somehow, miraculously, I made it. I collapsed onto the platform of my stand, gasping for air, my whole body shaking. Below me, the creature paced and snarled, occasionally rearing up to swipe at the base of the tree with massive, clawed hands. For hours, it circled my tree, never leaving, never losing interest. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I began to wonder if I'd make it out of this alive. My shoulder throbbed where its claws had caught me, and I could feel blood soaking through my jacket. As darkness fell, the creature's pacing became more agitated. It would disappear into the shadows for long moments, only to suddenly reappear on the other side of the tree. The psychological toll was almost worse than the physical danger, the constant state of alertness, never knowing where it might appear next. I don't know how long I sat there, my rifle clutched to my chest, every muscle tense and ready. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the dark, with only the occasional growl or snap of a branch to break the silence. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees that the creature finally melted back into the forest. Even then, I waited, terrified that it might be a trick, that it was just waiting for me to let my guard down. When I finally climbed down from my stand, my legs were so stiff I could barely walk. I made my way back to my truck in a daze, jumping at every sound, half expecting to see that monstrous form lunging at me from behind every tree. I've been back to those woods since then, but never alone, and never without an overwhelming sense of dread. I've searched for answers, pored over local legends and cryptozoology websites. I've heard whispers of other encounters, of a creature that shouldn't exist stalking the remote corners of our forests. Most people don't believe me when I tell them what happened. They chalk it up to fear, to an overactive imagination, to the tricks that solitude can play on the mind. But I know what I saw. I have the scars to prove it. So if you're ever out in the deep woods, and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, Something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Just get out of there as fast as you can. Because there are things in this world that defy explanation. Creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of what we think we know. And sometimes, when we venture too far into their territory, we find ourselves face to face with a reality we're not prepared to accept. As for me, I still hunt. But now, I'm always watching the tree line, always listening for that telltale growl, because I know that out there, somewhere in the darkest parts of the forest, something is watching me back, and next time, I might not be so lucky. Story 9. There's something about an abandoned cabin in the woods that just begs you to stop. Maybe it's the mystery of who built it, who lived there, and why they left. Or maybe it's the isolation, the way it stands alone, forgotten, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. But I'll tell you this, not all forgotten places are meant to be found. That night, we learned that lesson the hard way. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, Ben, and a couple of our buddies, Josh and Eric, getting away from the stress of our day-to-day lives. We'd hiked deep into a forest that most people don't even bother with, some miles off the usual trails in Washington state. The kind of place where you really feel like you're on your own. It was mid-October, the air crisp and cool, the trees painted in fiery reds and oranges. Perfect weather for a couple of nights under the stars. We had planned to hike all day, camp by the lake, and maybe even fish a bit before heading back. But as dusk started to settle in, we realized we were farther from our intended campsite than we thought. That's when we stumbled on the cabin. It sat tucked away between the trees, half hidden by the undergrowth, like it had been waiting there for us to find it. The wood was old and weathered, the roof sagging in places, but it looked solid enough. The windows were grimy, caked in dust and dirt, but they were still intact, which seemed like a miracle given how run down the place looked. There was a porch, too, with an old rocking chair that swayed gently in the breeze, even though there was no wind. Josh spotted it first. "You guys seeing this?" he called out, stopping dead in his tracks. We all turned to look. There it was, just off the trail, barely visible in the fading light. Ben frowned, adjusting his pack. "Didn't think we were anywhere near civilization." "We're not," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Eric laughed, but it sounded forced. "Well, looks like we got ourselves a place to crash for the night. Beats setting up the tents." Something about it didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to bend toward the cabin, their branches like skeletal fingers, or the unnatural stillness in the air. No birds, no wind, nothing. But we were losing daylight fast, and none of us were eager to keep hiking in the dark. "Let's check it out," Josh said, already heading toward the porch. I exchanged a look with Ben. He shrugged, but I could see the same unease in his eyes. Still, we followed Josh and Eric toward the cabin. Up close, it was even more eerie. The wood creaked beneath our boots as we stepped onto the porch, and that damn rocking chair kept swaying, slow and rhythmic. The front door was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. Josh, being Josh, didn't hesitate. He gave the door a push, and it groaned as it swung open, revealing the dark interior. We stood there for a moment, staring into the cabin. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the faint smell of rot. It wasn't much, just one large room with a stone fireplace, a rickety wooden table, and a couple of chairs that looked like they'd collapse if you sat on them. But it was dry, and after a long day of hiking, that was enough. "Looks like home for the night," Josh said, grinning as he dropped his pack near the door. I hesitated at the threshold, that uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. The place felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there, but the sun had dipped below the horizon and the temperature was dropping fast. We didn't have much choice. Ben must have noticed me lingering. "You all right, man?" he asked quietly. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just weird vibe, you know." He chuckled. "It's old and creepy. Perfect for a horror movie. We'll be fine. We gathered inside, setting up our gear and starting a fire in the fireplace. The flames cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, making the place feel even smaller. We cooked up some food, and for a while, the warmth and the glow of the fire eased the tension. We laughed, talked about the hike, made plans for the next day, but as the hours dragged on, that uneasy feeling crept back in. The cabin was too quiet. Even with the fire crackling and the sound of our voices, there was this underlying silence that pressed in on us, like the woods themselves were listening. At some point, Eric wandered over to the window. He wiped a hand across the grime, trying to get a better look outside, but the darkness was impenetrable. "You guys ever wonder why someone would just leave a place like this?" he asked, his voice low. Josh, who had been dozing by the fire, opened one eye. "Who cares? It's probably been empty for years. Place is falling apart." Ben, though, was staring at the walls now, a frown creasing his brow. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here in a long time, but it's strange, isn't it? I mean, look around. The furniture's still here. The door wasn't locked." I felt a chill run down my spine. He was right. It was like whoever had lived here had just left. In a hurry. Maybe, Josh shrugged. Maybe they just moved on. People abandon stuff all the time. Eric glanced back at us, his face illuminated by the firelight. Or maybe something made them leave. That sent a ripple of unease through the group. We all fell silent, listening to the fire crackle. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, growing darker, deeper. I stared into the flames, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching us from the corners of the room. Then we heard it, a knock. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe one of the branches outside scraping against the wall. But then it came again, louder this time, a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. We all froze. "The hell was that?" Josh whispered, sitting up straight now, all traces of sleep gone from his face. Ben stood up, moving toward the door, his hand instinctively going for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "Stay here," he muttered, his voice low. The knock came again, closer this time. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window. Eric backed away from the window, his face pale. "There's no one out there," he said, his voice shaking. "I looked. There's nothing." Ben reached the door, gripping the handle tightly, but he didn't open it. None of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the window, waiting. Another knock. Slow, hollow, like someone or something was tapping against the glass. Josh, always the skeptic, grabbed the flashlight from his pack and clicked it on. "Screw this. I'm checking it out." Before we could stop him, he marched over to the window, shining the beam outside. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the underbrush. For a moment there was nothing, just the empty woods. Then the beam flickered over something in the trees, a face, pale, gaunt, eyes wide and staring and unblinking. It was only visible for a split second before Josh jerked the flashlight away, his breath catching in his throat. What the hell was that?" he stammered, backing away from the window. I didn't see it, but the look on Josh's face told me all I needed to know. He was scared, and Josh never got scared. Ben didn't wait. "We're leaving, now." We scrambled to pack up our gear, our movements frantic and clumsy. The air in the cabin felt heavy, oppressive, like it was closing in on us. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as we threw our packs over our shoulders and made for the door. As Ben yanked the door open, the wind hit us, cold and biting. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. But before we could step outside, we heard it again, the knocking. Only this time, it wasn't just from the window. It was from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. The sound surrounded us, filling the cabin, growing louder with each passing second. My heart raced as I glanced back at the fireplace, where the shadows seemed to writhe, twisting and curling in unnatural ways. "We have to go," I shouted, grabbing Eric's arm and pulling him toward the door. We burst out of the cabin, into the freezing night, the wind whipping around us. But the knocking didn't stop. It followed us, echoing in the trees, growing louder, faster as we stumbled down the trail. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it. Whatever had been knocking, whatever had been watching us, it was out there in the woods, following us. We didn't stop running until we reached the main trail, our breaths ragged, our legs burning. Only then did the knocking fade, swallowed by the wind. We never spoke about what happened that night. We never went back. Some places, once abandoned, are meant to stay that way, and some doors should never be opened. Story 10. I thought I was filming wildlife. Instead, I captured something that shouldn't exist. My name is Lisa, and I'm a wildlife documentarian. For years, I've traveled to the most remote corners of the world, capturing footage of animals in their natural habitats. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest last summer. It was supposed to be a straightforward assignment. 3 weeks in the wilderness, documenting the behavior of a recently discovered population of wolverines. I was excited about the prospect of capturing these elusive creatures on film. Little did I know that I'd end up with footage of something far more extraordinary and terrifying. The first few days were uneventful. I set up my base camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and the constant whisper of a nearby stream. My equipment was state-of-the-art, high-definition cameras, night vision gear, and motion-activated trail cams scattered throughout the area. It was on the 4th night that things started to get weird. I was reviewing the day's footage in my tent when I noticed something strange in one of the trail cam videos. At first, I thought it was just a bear wandering through the frame. But as I zoomed in and slowed the footage, my blood ran cold. The figure was bipedal, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like thick, dark fur. It moved with an uncanny grace, almost human-like, but not quite. For a split second, it turned towards the camera, and I caught a glimpse of a face that haunts me to this day. A mix of ape and man, with eyes that seemed to glow in the infrared light. I must have watched that clip 100 times that night, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs, a person in a suit. But deep down, I knew it was neither of those things. This was something else entirely. The next morning, I set out to investigate, my camera in hand and a mixture of excitement and fear coursing through my veins. I found the spot where the trail cam had captured the footage, and my heart sank. The camera was gone, torn from its mounting with enough force to bend the metal bracket. But there were other signs, huge, humanoid footprints pressed into the soft earth, tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on low-hanging branches, and the smell, a musky animal odor that hung heavy in the air. I spent the rest of the day filming everything I could find, my hands shaking as I documented each piece of evidence. As the sun began to set, I reluctantly headed back to camp, my mind racing with possibilities. That night, as I huddled in my tent reviewing the new footage, I heard it. A low, rumbling vocalization that was neither human nor any animal I recognized. It seemed to come from just beyond the circle of light cast by my lantern. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound came again. Closer this time. Then a shadow fell across my tent, something large, moving with deliberate slowness. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. I could hear deep, ragged breathing just inches away from where I sat. The thin fabric of my tent seemed like an absurdly inadequate barrier between me and whatever was out there. For what felt like hours, I sat motionless, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the presence moved away, and the forest fell silent once more, But I didn't sleep a wink that night, my hand clutched around my satellite phone, debating whether to call for an emergency extraction. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent on shaky legs. The campsite looked undisturbed, but there, pressed into the damp earth around my tent, were those same massive footprints I'd seen the day before. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. I continued to gather footage, driven by a mix of professional curiosity and a growing obsession with proving what I'd seen was real. More strange vocalizations echoed through the forest at night. Glimpses of a large, dark figure moving through the trees just at the edge of my vision became common, but it was always just out of reach of my cameras, as if it knew exactly where they were and how to avoid them. On my final night in the forest, it all came to a head. I was preparing to pack up my equipment when I heard a commotion outside. I emerged from my tent to find my campsite in disarray. My main camera, the one containing all my footage from the past weeks, was gone. Panic set in as I realized the implications. Without that footage, I had no proof of what I'd seen. In a moment of reckless determination, I grabbed my backup camera and a flashlight and set off into the darkening forest. I don't know how long I stumbled through the underbrush, calling out, shining my light into the shadows. The forest seemed to close in around me, every tree and bush a potential hiding place for the creature I'd been tracking, or had been tracking me. And then, in a small clearing, I saw it. The creature stood there, my camera dangling from one massive, hair-covered hand. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see every detail I'd missed before. The powerful muscles rippling beneath its fur, the intelligent gleam in its eyes, the almost human-like expression of curiosity on its face. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I raised my backup camera with trembling hands, desperate to capture this impossible encounter. The creature tilted its head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, with deliberate slowness, it placed my camera on the ground. Our eyes locked once more, and I swear I saw something there, not just animal intelligence, but a deep, ancient wisdom. A silent message passed between us, an understanding that some secrets are not meant to be shared with the world. In the blink of an eye, it was gone, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. When I finally managed to move, I retrieved my camera with shaking hands. The memory card was gone. Every bit of footage I'd captured over the past weeks, erased. But the creature had left something in its place, a tuft of coarse, dark hair caught in the camera's strap, a single piece of tangible evidence that what I'd seen was real. I made it back to my campsite in a daze and spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, jumping at every sound. When morning came, I packed up and hiked out, never so glad to see civilization in my life. I've spent months since then trying to make sense of what happened in those woods. I've pored over every book on cryptozoology I can find, reached out to others who claim to have had similar encounters. The tuft of hair was inconclusive. Tests showed DNA that was similar to human and great ape, but not quite matching either. I haven't shared my story widely. Who would believe me? A seasoned wildlife documentarian spinning tales of Bigfoot. I'd be laughed out of the industry, so I keep it to myself, this incredible secret. But I can't stop thinking about it, about the intelligence I saw in those eyes, about the deliberate way it returned my camera. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, I find myself wondering, was I really the observer in those woods, or was I the one being studied? And what other secrets might be hiding in the wild places of the world, just beyond the reach of our cameras and our understanding? I still make nature documentaries, but now, when I'm out in the wilderness with my camera, I'm always watching the tree line, always listening for that distinctive vocalization. Because I know the truth now, that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of what we think we know. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, or perhaps very unlucky. We might just catch a glimpse of them. But be warned, once you've seen what's hiding in the shadows, you can never unsee it. And you'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Story 11. There's a certain kind of confidence that comes with being alone in the wilderness, a kind of quiet arrogance that grows in a person after years of hunting in the deep woods. I'd always prided myself on knowing these forests better than anyone. I could track a deer through dense thicket or navigate by starlight when the clouds blotted out the moon. But that confidence can turn on you in an instant, and when it does, the wilderness has a way of reminding you just how small and vulnerable you really are. That reminder came for me on a cold evening in late November. I was up in northern Minnesota, deep in the forests near the Boundary Waters, hunting on land that hadn't seen many people since the first snow of the season. The forest was thick and dense, perfect for tracking elk, which is exactly what I was out there for. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, and my mind was on the usual, finding the right spot to settle in for the night, hoping to get a shot at something big come dawn. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and cold earth, and the only sound was the crunch of snow under my boots. I'd been tracking a decent-sized bull for a few hours, following its trail through the snow as it wound deeper into the woods. The tracks were fresh, the kind that still held the definition of each hoof. I was closing in, feeling good about my chances. But then, something changed. I came across another set of tracks. At first, I thought they belonged to a wolf. That wouldn't have been unusual up here, but as I knelt down to inspect them, I realized something was off. These tracks were much larger than any wolf prints I'd ever seen, and the shape was wrong, more elongated, with deep claw marks cutting into the snow. I stood up, scanning the woods around me. The trees were close, their dark silhouettes pressing in on all sides. The wind had picked up, making the branches creak overhead. I suddenly felt exposed, like I wasn't the one doing the hunting anymore. Still, I told myself it was just a large wolf, maybe a lone one, following the elk like I was. I adjusted my rifle, keeping it at the ready now, and continued along the trail. Though my steps were a little slower, more deliberate, the tracks continued for another mile or so, paralleling the elk's trail. But then they veered off, cutting through the trees at an angle. My gut told me to keep going after the elk, but something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, made me stop and look down that new trail. I hesitated. I'd hunted in these woods long enough to trust my instincts, and right then, my instincts were screaming at me. But curiosity has a way of overriding common sense, and before I knew it, I was following the new set of tracks, deeper into the forest. The light was fading, the sky turning that dull shade of grey that comes right before night falls. My breath clouded in front of me as I walked, the snow crunching underfoot, each step sounding louder in the growing quiet. The tracks were leading me downhill now, into a narrow ravine where the trees grew so close together their branches formed a canopy overhead, blocking out what little light remained. I felt it before I saw it. The presence. There's no other way to describe it. It was like the air got thicker, heavier, pressing down on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin despite the frigid temperature. I stopped walking, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes scanned the trees, the shadows, looking for something, anything, that might explain why I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. And then I saw it, just for a moment. A shape, moving between the trees. It was too fast, too fluid to be human, and far too large. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to make sense of it, but it was already gone, swallowed up by the shadows. I swallowed hard, gripping my rifle a little tighter. My rational mind tried to tell me it was just an animal, a bear, maybe, or even that wolf I'd been thinking about earlier, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I'd never seen anything move like that, silent, almost like it wasn't even touching the ground. I should have turned back right then, should have hightailed it out of those woods and headed for the safety of my truck, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, listening to the growing silence, waiting. Then I heard the branches snap. It wasn't far, 100 feet, maybe less. The sound was sharp, deliberate, like something big was moving through the underbrush, but I couldn't see it. Just the occasional flash of movement between the trees. I brought my rifle up, aiming into the darkness, trying to get a bead on whatever it was. My finger hovered over the trigger, but I didn't pull it, not yet. The snapping stopped. For a long moment, everything was still. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And then, without warning, the thing moved again, this time closer, much closer. My pulse raced. I swung the rifle toward the sound, but it was no use. The thing was fast, too fast. I caught a glimpse of it, dark fur, towering height, eyes that gleamed in the fading light, and then it was gone again, slipping through the trees like a ghost. I wasn't hunting anymore. I was being hunted. A cold sweat trickled down my back as I backed up, my boots crunching in the snow. I kept the rifle up, scanning the woods, trying to predict where it would come from next. But every time I thought I had it, it would vanish, leaving me standing there like a fool, waiting for the next sound, another snap. This time I didn't hesitate. I fired. The rifle cracked, the sound echoing through the trees. I could see the snow kick up where the bullet hit, but whatever I was shooting at wasn't there anymore. I'd missed. The forest went silent again. My heart was racing, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, circling me, watching me. I turned slowly, trying to cover every angle, but the trees were too thick, the shadows too deep. The tracks, those massive prints, were all around me now, crisscrossing in the snow. It had been here, right where I was standing, watching me the entire time. I took a step back, and then another. The weight of the rifle felt heavier now, like it wouldn't do a damn thing to whatever was out there. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out how I'd gone from the hunter to the hunted in a matter of hours. Then I saw it again. This time it didn't vanish. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just outside the reach of the fading light. Tall, taller than any man, any animal I'd ever seen. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, its eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. And it was looking right at me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched me, its eyes locked on mine. I should have fired, should have done something, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, unable to move as the thing stared me down. Then, slowly, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to come back, waiting for the sound of footsteps, of snapping branches. But the forest remained still. Finally, I lowered the rifle. My legs were shaking, my hands numb from the cold. I didn't care about the elk anymore. I didn't care about the hunt. I just wanted to get out of those woods. I made it back to the truck just as the last light of day disappeared. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing, trying to process what I'd seen. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever had been out there, watching me, hunting me, it would be back. And next time, I might not be so lucky. Story 12. I've spent my life protecting sheep from predators, but nothing could have prepared me for the night something decided to hunt us all. My name's Mark, and I've been a shepherd for over 2 decades. I've faced down coyotes, fended off wolves, and even squared off with the occasional mountain lion. But what happened last spring on the high mountain pastures of Montana, well, it shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was late April, and we'd just moved the flock up to the summer grazing lands. The nights were still crisp, but the days were getting warmer, and the grass was lush and green, perfect sheep country. I had about 500 head under my care, spread out across a few hundred acres of rolling hills and sparse woodland. The first few nights were quiet, peaceful even. I'd make my rounds, check on the flock, then settle in by my campfire with a cup of coffee and my old dog, Blue. The stars up there are something else. So bright and clear you feel like you could reach out and touch them. It was on the fourth night that things started to feel off. I was doing my usual evening check when I noticed some of the sheep acting skittish. They were bunching up tighter than usual, eyes wide, constantly looking towards the tree line at the edge of the pasture. Blue was on edge too, growling low in his throat, hackles raised. I chalked it up to a coyote or maybe a bear passing through. Nothing unusual for these parts, but as I made my way back to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. You know that prickle on the back of your neck, the one that tells you you're not alone? It was like that, but stronger than I'd ever felt before. As the night wore on, the feeling only intensified. The usual night sounds, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, seemed muted, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I found myself pacing, shotgun in hand, eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the firelight. It was nearing midnight when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Blue was on his feet in an instant, barking furiously at the shadows. I raised my shotgun, scanning the tree line, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, at the edge of the firelight, I saw them, eyes. Not the familiar gleam of a coyote or wolf, but something larger, set higher off the ground, and there was an intelligence in them, a cold calculation that sent a chill down my spine. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare off whatever it was. The eyes disappeared, but the feeling of being watched remained. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. When dawn finally broke, I did a head count. All the sheep were accounted for, but they were nervous, huddled together and reluctant to graze. As I walked the perimeter of the pasture, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tracks, but not like any I'd ever seen before. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. And the stride, whatever made these was big, really big. I followed them to the fence line and felt my stomach drop. The top wire, a good 5 feet off the ground, was bent and covered in coarse, dark hair. I radioed down to the ranch, trying to keep the shake out of my voice as I reported what I'd found. The boss listened patiently, then told me to sit tight. He'd send up some extra hands and we'd do a thorough search of the area. But as the day wore on and the sun began to set, no one had arrived. The radio was silent. No matter how many times I tried to call, I was on my own. As night fell, I could feel the tension in the air. The sheep were restless, bleating nervously and pressing close together. Blue stayed by my side, growling at the slightest sound from the forest. I loaded my shotgun and settled in for what I knew would be a long night. The attack came just after midnight. A chorus of terrified bleats erupted from the far side of the pasture, followed by the sound of running hooves and snapping jaws. I was on my feet in an instant, racing towards the commotion with Blue at my heels. What I saw when I got there, I still have trouble believing it even now. A massive dark shape was moving through the flock with impossible speed and grace. It was upright, like a man, but much larger and covered in thick, shaggy fur. As it turned towards me, I caught a glimpse of a face that was neither human nor animal, with eyes that glowed in the moonlight. I raised my shotgun and fired, the blast impossibly loud in the night air. The creature stumbled, letting out a roar that shook the very ground beneath my feet, but it didn't go down. Instead, it seemed to grow even more enraged, charging towards me with terrifying speed. I fired again and again, but it was like shooting at a shadow. The thing was impossibly fast, dodging and weaving as it closed the distance between us. In desperation, I threw down the gun and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought but escape. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls gaining ground with each second. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I burst out of the tree line and saw my cabin ahead, a beacon of safety in the darkness. I hit the door at full speed, nearly tearing it off its hinges as I tumbled inside. I slammed it shut and threw the bolt, then collapsed against it, gasping for air. Outside, I could hear the creature circling, its deep, guttural breathing just inches from where I sat. For hours, it prowled around the cabin, occasionally throwing itself against the walls with enough force to make the whole structure shudder. I sat there, shotgun clutched to my chest, every muscle tense and ready. Blue huddled beside me, whimpering softly. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the sounds outside finally ceased. But I didn't dare move, didn't dare hope it was over. It wasn't until the sun was high in the sky that I finally found the courage to open the door. The pasture was a scene of carnage. Dozens of sheep lay dead or dying, torn apart with savage efficiency. But it was the tracks that truly horrified me. Massive, clawed prints that led off into the forest, along with a trail of blood that suggested my shots had found their mark. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, tending to the surviving sheep and trying to make sense of what had happened. When the ranch hands finally arrived that evening, drawn by my silence on the radio, I told them everything. They listened with growing disbelief, exchanging glances that clearly said they thought I'd lost my mind. But the evidence was there. The dead sheep, the tracks, the damage to the cabin. Something had attacked us. Something that defied easy explanation. In the days that followed, search parties combed the woods, but found no sign of the creature. The official report chalked it up to a rogue bear, despite the evidence that clearly showed otherwise. Most people were all too eager to accept this explanation, to file away the incident as just another tale of wildlife encounters gone wrong. But I know what I saw that night. I know it wasn't a bear or a wolf or any other known predator. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist in our world of science and reason. I still work as a shepherd, but never alone, and never without a high-powered rifle close at hand. And on dark nights, when the wind whispers through the pines and shadows seem to move of their own accord, I find myself scanning the tree line, listening for that distinctive growl. Because now I know the truth, that there are things out there in the wilderness that we can't explain, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization, and sometimes, when we least expect it, they step out of legend and into our world, reminding us that we're not always at the top of the food chain. So if you're ever out in the wild places of the world and you get that feeling of being watched, that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you something's not right, pay attention. Because you never know what might be hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Story 13. I used to think the scariest things in life were the ones you could see coming. Now I know it's the dangers that catch you off guard, the ones that turn an ordinary day into a waking nightmare. My name's Karen, and I've been a runner for as long as I can remember. There's nothing I love more than an early morning jog through the woods near my home. The crisp air, the solitude, the rhythm of my feet hitting the trail. It's always been my way of finding peace before the chaos of the day begins. But after what happened last Tuesday, I'm not sure I'll ever feel that sense of peace again. It started like any other morning. I woke up before dawn, laced up my running shoes, and headed out just as the first hints of light were starting to peek through the trees. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of pine and last night's rain. I took my usual trail, a winding path that cuts through the heart of the forest. I knew every root and rock by heart, could run it with my eyes closed if I had to. The familiar burn in my lungs, the steady thump of my heart, it all felt right, normal, until it didn't. I was about 2 miles in when I first noticed something was off. The birds had gone quiet, not gradually like they sometimes do when a storm's rolling in, but all at once. One moment the forest was alive with their morning songs, and the next, silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I slowed to a jog, then a walk, straining my ears for any sound, but there was nothing. No rustling leaves, no scurrying animals, just the sound of my own breathing, suddenly too loud in the stillness. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the gnarled old oaks that lined the trail. But as I peered closer, I realized it was something else entirely, something that shouldn't be there. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and spindly like bare tree branches. But it wasn't a tree. It was moving, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel, and then it turned, and I saw its face, or rather, where its face should have been. There were no features, no eyes or mouth or nose, just a blank, pale oval, smooth as polished bone. For a moment, we just stared at each other, me frozen in terror and it utterly still, save for that slight, unnatural swaying. Then it took a step toward me, and the spell broke. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, my feet barely touching the ground as I tore down the trail. I could hear it behind me, not running, but moving with a speed that defied its gangly appearance. Branches snapped and leaves rustled, the sounds growing closer with each passing second. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I veered off the trail, crashing through the underbrush, hoping to lose it in the denser parts of the forest. But it was no use. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how many twists and turns I took, I could feel it right behind me. Its presence was like a physical weight, pressing down on me, driving the air from my lungs. I burst out of the tree line and onto the road that led back to town, my legs nearly giving out as I hit the pavement. Cars whizzed by, their drivers oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just feet away. I wanted to scream, to wave my arms, to do anything to get their attention, but I couldn't spare the breath, couldn't risk slowing down for even a second. As I rounded the bend that would bring me within sight of the first houses, I finally dared to look back. The thing was there, right at the edge of the forest, its blank face turned toward me. It didn't step onto the road, didn't make any move to continue the chase. It just stood there, watching. I didn't stop running until I reached my front door, fumbling with my keys as I practically fell inside. I slammed the door shut and collapsed against it, gasping for air, my whole body shaking. For hours, I sat there, unable to move, unable to process what had happened. When I finally found the courage to look out the window, the street was normal. People walking their dogs, kids riding bikes, not a care in the world, no sign of the thing that had chased me. I called in sick to work that day, and the next, I couldn't bring myself to leave the house, couldn't shake the feeling that if I stepped outside, it would be there waiting for me. When I finally did venture out, it was in my car, windows up and doors locked, taking the long way around to avoid driving past the forest. I've spent the weeks since then trying to make sense of what happened. I've scoured the internet for similar stories, reached out to local historians about legends or myths that might explain what I saw. But there's nothing, no rational explanation for the thing in the woods. Some days, I can almost convince myself it was all in my head, a hallucination brought on by dehydration, or maybe a vivid waking dream. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or feel that prickle on the back of my neck that tells me I'm being watched. And it all comes rushing back. I still run, but never alone, and never in the woods. I stick to well-lit streets in busy neighborhoods, always with a friend or a running group. But even there, surrounded by people and the trappings of civilization, I can't shake the feeling that it's out there somewhere, watching and waiting. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the shadows seem to move of their own accord, I find myself wondering, what if I hadn't been fast enough that day? What if it had caught me? What would have happened? I don't think I want to know the answer. So I keep running, trying to outpace the memory of that morning and the questions it left behind. But deep down, I know the truth, that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of what we think we know. And sometimes, when we least expect it, they step out of the shadows and into our lives, shattering our sense of safety and leaving us forever changed. If you're ever out for a run, especially in the early morning hours when the world is still and quiet, pay attention to your surroundings. Listen to that little voice in the back of your mind, the one that tells you when something's not right. Because you never know what might be hiding just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. And if you ever find yourself face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that defies all logic and reason, don't try to understand it. Don't stand your ground. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and pray that it's enough. Because in a world where such things exist, sometimes running is the only option we have, and sometimes it's the only thing that keeps us alive. Story 14. The howl that pierced the night wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It sent chills down my spine and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. In my 15 years as a forest ranger, I'd encountered all sorts of wildlife, but this was different. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've dedicated my life to protecting and preserving the wilderness of Pine Ridge National Forest. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. But that night changed everything. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where your breath forms little clouds in the air and the leaves crunch satisfyingly beneath your boots. I was on my usual night patrol, flashlight in hand, senses alert for any signs of trouble. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Even the crickets seemed to have gone silent. I'd just rounded a bend in the trail when I heard it, a long, mournful howl that started low and rose to a blood-curdling pitch. It wasn't a wolf, coyote, or any other animal I could identify. My heart rate quickened, and I instinctively reached for the radio at my belt, though I didn't call in just yet. No need to alarm the station over what could be nothing. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I clicked off my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The full moon provided just enough light to navigate by. As I moved deeper into the woods, away from the main trail, the trees seemed to close in around me. Their branches reached out like gnarled fingers, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. That's when I saw them, the tracks. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to examine them. They were huge, easily twice the size of a man's foot, with clear imprints of toes and what looked like claws. I'd seen bear tracks before, but these were different. They were more elongated, almost human-like, but far too large. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking slightly as I snapped a few photos. The flash illuminated the area briefly, and I could have sworn I saw movement in the underbrush just beyond. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly stood up, eyes scanning the darkness. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small and vulnerable in the vast silence of the forest. There was no response, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I was a professional, after all. I'd dealt with lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, and even the occasional poacher. Whatever this was, I could handle it, or so I told myself. As I continued to follow the tracks, the forest seemed to grow denser. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy now, and I had to use my flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, creating shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. More than once, I thought I saw a large, dark figure just at the edge of the light, only for it to disappear when I looked directly at it. The tracks led me to a small clearing. In the center stood an old, gnarled oak tree, its bare branches reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. As I approached, my light fell upon something that made my blood run cold. Stuck to the bark, about 7 feet up, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. With trembling hands, I reached up and plucked it from the tree. It was unlike any animal fur I'd ever seen, thick and wiry, almost like human hair, but not quite. I placed it in a small evidence bag, my mind racing with possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something large moving between the trees. My heart leapt into my throat. "This is Ranger Mitchell," I said into my radio, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm at grid coordinates 3742. I've found some unusual tracks and I think there's something out here with me." Static crackled for a moment before a response came through. "Copy that, Sarah. What's your situation?" Before I could reply, another twig snapped, closer this time. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting from tree to tree. That's when I saw them, two glowing eyes reflecting the light, set high above the ground. They blinked once, then disappeared. I'm not sure," I whispered into the radio. "I'm going to head back to the ranger station. Send backup to meet me halfway." "Copy that. Be careful, Sarah." I started walking backwards, keeping my eyes on the spot where I'd seen the glowing eyes. My flashlight trembled in my hand, casting jittery shadows across the forest floor. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sounded like footsteps to my paranoid ears. As I reached the edge of the clearing, a low growl emanated from the darkness. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep and guttural, almost human but not quite. My fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear something moving behind me, keeping pace easily. It was big, whatever it was, and fast. The sound of its heavy breathing mixed with my own panicked gasps. I burst out onto the main trail, my lungs burning. In the distance, I could see the headlights of an approaching vehicle, the backup I'd requested. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't slow down. I sprinted towards the lights, casting a glance over my shoulder. What I saw nearly made me trip over my own feet. Illuminated briefly by the moonlight was a massive, hair-covered figure. It stood upright like a man, but was easily 8 feet tall, with long arms that almost reached the ground. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the gleam of its eyes and the flash of teeth. I let out a scream that tore at my throat and pushed myself harder. The creature let out another bone-chilling howl, the same one I'd heard earlier, and then disappeared into the woods. Moments later, I collapsed into the arms of my fellow rangers, gasping for breath and babbling about what I'd seen. They looked at me with concern and disbelief, but when I showed them the photos of the tracks and the tuft of hair, their expressions changed to ones of confusion and worry. In the days that followed, we scoured the area but found no further signs of the creature. The higher-ups chalked it up to a bear, despite the evidence not quite fitting. They were eager to sweep the whole incident under the rug, afraid of the panic it might cause if word got out. But I know what I saw that night. Sometimes, when I'm on patrol and the moon is full, I can feel eyes watching me from the darkness. I hear rustling in the underbrush that's just a little too deliberate to be the wind. And occasionally, carried on the night air, I hear that haunting howl. The forests hide many secrets, and I discovered one of them that night. Whatever it was, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or something else entirely, it's out there, and sometimes, in my darkest moments, I fear it's watching, waiting for another chance encounter. So if you ever find yourself in Pine Ridge National Forest, stick to the trails, keep your wits about you, and if you hear an otherworldly howl echoing through the trees, run. Run as fast as you can, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of your flashlight beam. Story 15. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. But what if the story those words tell is one of unimaginable horror? My name is Tom, and I've been a nature photographer for over a decade. I've captured images of everything from majestic elephants in the African savanna to elusive snow leopards in the Himalayas. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest last autumn. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a week in a remote area known for its pristine wilderness and diverse wildlife. I was excited about the prospect of photographing some of the region's more elusive creatures, maybe a black bear or even a cougar if I was lucky. I set up my base camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to touch the sky. The first few days were uneventful, filled with long hikes and patient waits in carefully chosen spots. I managed to get some decent shots of deer, a family of raccoons, and even a playful river otter. It was on the fourth night that things took a turn for the bizarre. I was reviewing the day's images on my laptop when I noticed something strange in the background of one of the shots. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe an oddly shaped tree trunk, but as I zoomed in, my blood ran cold. There, partially obscured by the foliage, was a figure. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with a massive, bulky frame covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. The face was blurry, but I could make out eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence. I must have stared at that image for hours, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs, a hoax perpetrated by local pranksters. But deep down, I knew it was neither of those things. This was something else entirely. Sleep eluded me that night. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the occasional hoot of an owl. And underneath it all, a new sound that sent shivers down my spine. Heavy footsteps, circling my camp just beyond the reach of my lantern's glow. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent on shaky legs. The campsite looked undisturbed, but there, pressed into the soft earth around my tent, were footprints, huge, humanoid prints that made my own boots look like a child's in comparison. I spent the day in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept wandering back to that image and those footprints. As the sun began to set, I found myself dreading the coming night in a way I never had before. I decided to set up some trail cameras around my camp, hoping to catch another glimpse of whatever it was that was out there. As I was securing the last camera to a tree, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The forest had gone eerily silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just that growl, growing louder by the second. And then I saw it. It emerged from the shadows between 2 massive pines, its movements fluid and purposeful despite its enormous size. In the fading daylight, I could see every detail I'd missed in that blurry photograph. The powerful muscles rippling beneath its fur, the long, curved claws on its massive hands, the almost human-like expression of curiosity on its face. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I raised my camera with trembling hands, some deep-rooted instinct to document overriding my fear. The creature tilted its head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, faster than anything that size should be able to move, it was gone, melting back into the forest as if it had never been there at all. I spent that night huddled in my tent, every muscle tense, straining my ears for any sound of the creature's return. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig had me convinced it was right outside, waiting to tear through the thin fabric that suddenly seemed like a woefully inadequate barrier. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I finally dared to emerge. The campsite was a mess, my equipment scattered, some of it broken beyond repair. But it was the trail cameras that truly chilled me to the bone. Every single one had been torn from its mounting, the memory cards crushed to pieces, every single one, except for the last camera I had set up, the one I had been working on when the creature appeared. With shaking hands, I retrieved the memory card and slotted it into my laptop. Most of the footage was normal, leaves rustling in the breeze, a squirrel scampering past, and then, at 3:17 a.m., it appeared. The creature moved into frame with that same unnatural grace I had witnessed. It seemed to look directly into the camera, its eyes glowing in the infrared light. Then, slowly and deliberately, it reached out one massive hand and plucked the camera from the tree. The next few seconds of footage were a blur of motion as the camera was lifted high into the air. And then, for just a moment, everything steadied. I found myself looking at a close-up of the creature's face, filling the entire frame. Those eyes, so human yet so alien, stared directly into the lens. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and it let out a roar that distorted the camera's audio into static. The video ended there. I packed up camp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my bootlaces. The hike back to my car was a blur of paranoia, every shadow seeming to hide a monstrous figure, every sound a potential threat. I've spent months since then trying to make sense of what happened in those woods. I've pored over every book on cryptozoology I can find, reached out to others who claim to have had similar encounters, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. The photo and video evidence I managed to capture has been analyzed by every expert I could find. Some dismiss it as an elaborate hoax. Others claim it's a known species, just captured at an odd angle. But a few look at those images with the same mix of awe and terror that I feel every time I see them. I haven't shared my story widely. Who would believe me? A nature photographer spinning tales of Bigfoot encounters. I'd be laughed out of the industry, so I keep it to myself, this incredible secret. But I can't stop thinking about it, about the intelligence I saw in those eyes, about the deliberate way it destroyed most of my evidence but left just enough to haunt me. I still work as a photographer, but I stick to more populated areas now. No more solo trips into remote wilderness. And I'm always watchful, always listening. Because now I know the truth, that there are things out there in the wild places of the world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of what we think we know. So if you're ever out in the wilderness and you get that feeling of being watched, that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you something's not right, pay attention. Because you never know what might be hiding just out of frame, waiting for the perfect moment to step into view and change your understanding of the world forever. And if you're lucky enough to capture evidence of something extraordinary, think carefully before you share it with the world, because once you've seen what's hiding in the shadows, you can never unsee it, and you'll never look at the wilderness or yourself quite the same way again. Story 16. The zipper inched down slowly, each metallic click echoing in the stillness of the night. My wife Lisa and I lay frozen in our sleeping bags, hardly daring to breathe. Whatever was out there, it was about to reveal itself. I'm Mike Henderson, an avid outdoorsman with years of camping experience under my belt, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains. It had started as a perfect getaway. Lisa and I had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature and each other. We'd hiked deep into the backcountry, far from any marked trails or campgrounds. The solitude was exhilarating, the scenery breathtaking. As we set up our tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, I remember thinking how lucky we were to have this slice of paradise all to ourselves. If only I'd known then how wrong I was. The first 2 days were idyllic. We hiked, fished in crystal-clear streams, and spent our evenings stargazing by the campfire. On the third night, exhausted from a long day of exploration, we turned in early. The gentle patter of rain on the tent lulled us to sleep. I'm not sure what time it was when I first heard it, a soft, crunching sound like footsteps on pine needles. At first, I dismissed it as wildlife, probably a deer or maybe a raccoon scavenging for food, but then came a low, rumbling growl that made my blood run cold. "Lisa," I whispered, gently shaking her awake. "Do you hear that?" She stirred, blinking sleepily. "Here, what?" Her words cut off as another growl, louder this time, resonated through the night air. Her eyes widened in fear, mirroring my own. We lay there, scarcely breathing, as whatever it was circled our tent. The footsteps were heavy, far too heavy for any normal forest creature. Each step sent a slight tremor through the ground, and I could hear branches snapping under its weight. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the tent, a massive, hulking silhouette projected against the thin fabric by the moonlight. Lisa stifled a gasp, clutching my arm so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my skin. The creature, and I was certain now that it was no ordinary animal, sniffed loudly at the tent. I could hear its heavy breathing, feel the warmth of its exhales against the nylon. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. A bear. No, this thing was bipedal. A man. But no man could be this large, this powerful. For what felt like an eternity, we remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe. The creature continued its investigation, occasionally emitting low grunts and snuffles. I racked my brain for what to do. Our car was miles away, and even if we could somehow make a run for it, I doubted we could outpace this thing in the darkness. Just when I thought the tension might drive me mad, the shadow moved away. We heard more footsteps, growing fainter, and then silence. Lisa and I exchanged a glance, hardly daring to hope that it was over. That's when we heard the zipper. Slowly, agonizingly, the tent entrance began to open. In that moment, I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This was it. Whatever was out there was coming in, and we were trapped. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. As the zipper reached the halfway point, I clicked it on, aiming the beam at the widening gap. The light illuminated a massive, hairy hand, easily twice the size of my own. Thick, matted fur covered it, ending in wickedly curved claws. As the beam traveled upward, I caught a glimpse of a broad, muscular chest, also covered in dark hair. And then, just as the light would have revealed its face, the creature let out a bone-chilling roar and recoiled from the brightness. The tent shook violently as it thrashed backward, nearly collapsing on top of us. "Run!" I yelled, my voice hoarse with fear. I unzipped my sleeping bag and scrambled for the tent opening, pulling Lisa along with me. We burst out into the night, the cool air hitting us like a shock. In the pale moonlight, I caught a fleeting glimpse of our visitor. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with a bulk that put any bodybuilder to shame. Covered in dark, shaggy fur, it stood on 2 legs like a man, but there was nothing human about its hunched posture and elongated arms. As it turned to look at us, I saw its face, a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with glowing eyes that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. Lisa's scream snapped me out of my terrified trance. "Go!" I shouted, pushing her ahead of me. We plunged into the forest, branches whipping our faces as we ran blindly through the undergrowth. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the woods in pursuit. Its roars echoed through the trees, spurring us to run faster than I thought possible. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but pure adrenaline kept me going. We splashed through a shallow stream, the icy water shocking my system. "The rocks!" Lisa gasped, pointing to a jumble of boulders on the far bank. Without hesitation, we scrambled up them, hoping to lose our pursuer. Crouching behind a large rock, we held our breath, listening. The forest had gone eerily quiet. Had we lost it? I dared to peek around the boulder. There, on the other side of the stream, stood the creature. Its massive chest heaved as it sniffed the air, searching for our scent. In the moonlight, I could see its features more clearly, the heavy brow, the wide, flat nose, the powerful jaw. It was like something out of a cryptozoologist's wildest dreams, or nightmares. For a heart-stopping moment, its gaze seemed to lock onto our hiding spot. I pulled back, pressing myself against the cold stone, certain that at any second it would leap across the stream and be upon us. But then, miraculously, it turned away. With surprising grace for something so large, it loped back into the forest, its form quickly swallowed by the darkness. We waited for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even whisper. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to brighten the sky, we dared to stir from our hiding place. Cautiously, we made our way back to our campsite. The tent was in tatters, our supplies strewn about. Whatever that thing was, it had thoroughly ransacked our camp after we fled. We hastily gathered what we could salvage and began the long trek back to civilization. As we hiked, Lisa and I tried to make sense of what we'd experienced. A Bigfoot? Sasquatch? Some unknown species of primate? The rational part of my mind struggled to accept what we'd seen, but I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. When we finally reached our car, dirty, exhausted and still shaken, a part of me wanted to drive straight to the nearest ranger station and report what had happened. But who would believe us? We had no proof beyond our torn tent and wild story. In the harsh light of day, even I was starting to doubt the reality of our encounter. In the end, we decided to keep our experience to ourselves. We drove home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. But as we wound our way down from the mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. More than once, I caught myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a hulking figure emerge from the shadows. It's been months since that night, and I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, the echo of that otherworldly roar ringing in my ears. Lisa and I have been camping since then, but never in the backcountry. Somehow, the designated campgrounds with their picnic tables and fire pits have lost their appeal. I often find myself wondering about that creature. Was it unique, or are there others like it out there? How has it remained hidden for so long? And most chillingly, what would have happened if it had managed to get into our tent? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. The forests hide many secrets, and some of them have teeth and claws. So if you're planning a camping trip off the beaten path, my advice is this: zip your tent up tight, and if you hear something large moving around in the night, well, just pray it doesn't get curious about what's inside. Story 17. I've always believed that a photograph captures more than just an image. It freezes a moment in time, preserving details our eyes might miss. But that day in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, my camera caught something I wish I'd never seen. My name is Tom Reeves, and I'm a wildlife photographer. For the past decade, I've trekked through some of the most remote wilderness areas in North America, capturing images of elusive creatures in their natural habitats. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the shadowy depths of the Olympic National Forest. It was late September, and I'd been camping in the backcountry for nearly a week. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the landscape in a breathtaking array of reds, golds, and oranges. I'd gotten some fantastic shots of elk, black bears, and even a few rarely seen fisher cats. But I was after something more elusive: the marbled murrelet, an endangered seabird that nests high in old-growth trees. That particular day had been frustrating. I'd hiked miles into a particularly remote area of the forest, following a tip from a local ornithologist about a possible murrelet nesting site. But after hours of waiting quietly in a camouflage blind, I hadn't caught so much as a glimpse of the bird. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the towering firs and cedars, I decided to pack it in. I carefully stowed my camera gear and began the long hike back to my campsite. The forest was eerily quiet, with none of the usual chittering of squirrels or songs of evening birds. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving an unsettling stillness in the air. About halfway back to camp, I paused in a small clearing to catch my breath and take a few last shots of the fading light filtering through the canopy. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a primal surge of fear course through my body. Instinctively, I raised my camera and began snapping photos in a wide arc around the clearing. My hands were shaking, but years of practice allowed me to keep the shots relatively steady. I saw nothing out of the ordinary through the viewfinder, just trees, undergrowth, and deepening shadows. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the brush. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my heavy backpack thumping against my spine with each stride. I didn't stop until I reached my campsite, out of breath and heart pounding. As I huddled in my tent that night, I convinced myself that it had just been a bear, maybe a cougar, nothing unusual for these woods. But a nagging doubt gnawed at the back of my mind. That growl hadn't sounded like any animal I'd encountered before. The next morning, I broke camp early and hiked out to my car. I was eager to get back to civilization and review the photos I'd taken. The drive back to Seattle seemed to take forever, my mind replaying the events of the previous evening over and over. Finally, back in my small apartment, I uploaded the memory cards to my computer and began sorting through the day's shots. Most were what I expected. Beautiful, but ultimately unsuccessful attempts to capture the elusive murrelet. Scenic shots of the forest, a few decent images of other wildlife, and then I saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the fading light. But as I zoomed in, my blood ran cold. There, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir, was a figure. It was large, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear, with long arms that nearly reached the ground and a distinctly ape-like silhouette, but it was the face that made my heart stop. 2 gleaming eyes reflected the camera's flash, set deep in a face that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. And those eyes, they were staring directly at the camera, directly at me. I recoiled from the computer screen, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. This couldn't be real. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every hiker and camper in the Pacific Northwest knew tales of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. But I'd always dismissed them as folklore, campfire stories meant to spook tourists. Yet here was evidence, captured inadvertently by my own camera. I spent hours examining the photo, zooming in, adjusting contrast and shadows, looking for any sign that it could be a hoax or a misidentified bear, but the more I looked, the more convinced I became. This was something unknown to science, something that shouldn't exist. As night fell, I found myself jumping at every sound, a car backfiring on the street, a neighbor's door slamming. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those reflective orbs staring back at me. I debated what to do with the photo. Part of me wanted to share it with the world, to finally provide concrete evidence of the creature's existence. But another part, a more primal part, warned me of the dangers. What if it came looking for me? What if there were others like it? In the end, I decided to keep the photo to myself, at least for the time being. I needed time to process what I'd seen, to come to terms with how it changed my understanding of the world. As the days passed, I found myself unable to stay away from the forest. The photo haunted me, driving me to return to that remote area of Olympic National Forest. I told myself I was looking for more evidence, for a chance to see the creature again in the flesh. But deep down, I think I was hoping to prove to myself that it had all been a mistake, a coincidence of light and shadow. Each trip into the backcountry left me more on edge. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. I'd find myself whirling around, camera at the ready, only to capture nothing but empty forest. But sometimes, in the deepening twilight or the misty dawn, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of my vision. A flash of dark fur, the sound of heavy footsteps, a low rumble that might have been a growl, never enough to photograph, never enough to prove anything. just enough to keep me coming back, driven by a mixture of fascination and fear. One evening, about a month after my initial encounter, I was setting up camp in a small clearing when I heard it. That same otherworldly growl that had started this whole obsession. It was close, too close, and before I could react, I saw a massive shape emerge from the shadows between two ancient cedars. Time seemed to stand still as I stared at the creature, and it stared back at me. In person, it was even more imposing than in the photograph. Muscles rippled beneath its shaggy coat as it stood upright, towering over me. Its face was more expressive than I'd imagined, with startlingly intelligent eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. For a long moment, we regarded each other. I was frozen in place, my camera forgotten at my side. A part of me screamed to run, but a deeper instinct told me that any sudden movement would be a deadly mistake. Then, with a grace that belied its enormous size, the creature turned and melted back into the forest. The entire encounter lasted no more than a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. As its footsteps faded into the distance, I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my satellite phone, desperate to call for help, to tell someone what I'd seen, but as my finger hovered over the dial button, I hesitated. Who would believe me? And more importantly, what would happen to this magnificent, impossible creature if the world learned of its existence? In that moment, I made a decision. I packed up my gear and hiked out of the forest, driving straight back to Seattle. The next day, I booked a flight to New York City, as far from the Pacific Northwest as I could get. I still have that photo, locked away in a safe deposit box. Sometimes I'm tempted to release it, to share my discovery with the world. But then I remember those eyes, that moment of connection in the forest, and I know I made the right choice. The wilderness holds many secrets, and some of them are better left undiscovered. As for me, I've hung up my wildlife photography gear. These days, I stick to photographing cityscapes and street scenes, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself looking out at the city skyline and wondering about what's out there in the deep, dark woods, and whether it's wondering about me, too. Story 18. The crunch of leaves behind me wasn't my imagination. Something was following me, and it wasn't human. My name is Emily Parker, and I've been an avid hiker for as long as I can remember. The trails have always been my sanctuary, a place where I could clear my mind and feel at one with nature. But that day in the Adirondack Mountains changed everything. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on what was supposed to be a day-long solo hike. The trail was one I'd never taken before, winding deep into a less-traveled part of the park. The forest was ablaze with fall colors, the air crisp and invigorating. As I laced up my boots at the trailhead, I felt that familiar surge of excitement that always comes with exploring new terrain. The first few hours were uneventful. I made good time, pausing occasionally to take in the breathtaking views or snap a photo of particularly vibrant foliage. By noon, I'd reached a scenic overlook where I stopped to eat my packed lunch. As I sat on a sun-warmed rock, gazing out over the rolling hills, painted in shades of red and gold, I felt completely at peace. If only I'd known then how quickly that peace would shatter. It was shortly after I resumed hiking that I first noticed something was off. The forest, which had been alive with the chittering of squirrels and the songs of birds, had gone eerily quiet. It was as if someone had suddenly hit the mute button on the world. I paused, straining my ears, but all I could hear was the whisper of wind through the leaves. I shook off the unease and pressed on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me. Every few minutes, I'd whirl around, certain I'd catch sight of whatever was causing this sensation, but each time I saw nothing but trees and underbrush. As the afternoon wore on, my unease grew. The trail seemed to be getting less distinct, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I hadn't seen a blaze marker in quite some time. Had I somehow strayed off the main path? I pulled out my map and compass, trying to orient myself, but the densely packed trees made it difficult to get my bearings. That's when I heard it, a distinct snap of a branch behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding small and vulnerable in the vast silence of the forest. No response came, but I could have sworn I saw movement in the shadows between the trees. I picked up my pace, no longer caring about the scenery. My only thought was to find my way back to a marked trail, back to civilization. But with each step, I became more certain that something was following me. I could hear it moving through the underbrush, always just out of sight. Panic began to set in. I broke into a jog, then a run, my backpack thumping against my spine as I crashed through the forest. Branches whipped at my face, and roots seemed to reach up to trip me. But still the presence behind me kept pace, growing bolder. Now I could clearly hear its footfalls, heavy and deliberate. I chanced a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. There, no more than 50 feet behind me, was a dark, hulking shape moving through the trees. It was too big to be a person, too upright to be a bear. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. In my distraction, I failed to notice the fallen log in my path. My foot caught, and I went sprawling, landing hard on the forest floor. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to my feet, but I knew I couldn't stop. Limping badly, I pressed on, fighting back tears of pain and terror. The thing behind me was closer now. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell a musky, animal odor. In desperation, I veered off the faint trail I'd been following, hoping to lose my pursuer in the thick underbrush. I ducked under low-hanging branches and squeezed between tightly packed trees, ignoring the scrapes and scratches I was accumulating. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst into a small clearing. In the center stood an old fire tower, its metal frame rusted but still intact. Without hesitation, I hobbled toward it, praying the stairs would hold my weight. I'd just reached the base of the tower when a low, rumbling growl froze me in my tracks. Slowly I turned around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the creature that had been stalking me. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy, dark fur. It stood on 2 legs like a man, but there was nothing human about its hunched posture and elongated arms. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, certain that at any second it would charge and tear me apart, but it made no move to approach. Instead, it tilted its head, regarding me with what almost seemed like curiosity. The spell was broken by the distant sound of voices, hikers on a nearby trail. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, then back to me. It let out a low grunt, then turned and loped back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I scrambled up the fire tower stairs, my injured ankle screaming in protest. From the top, I could see for miles in every direction. More importantly, I could see a marked trail not far from the clearing. Using my phone's GPS, I was able to pinpoint my location and call for help. As I waited for the rescue team, huddled in the old fire lookout station, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Could it have been a bear, somehow misidentified in my panic? But I knew, deep down, that what I'd encountered was something unknown to science, something that shouldn't exist. When the rescue team arrived, I told them I'd gotten lost and injured my ankle. I said nothing about the creature. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled a kook, my story dismissed as the hallucination of a frightened, exhausted hiker. In the days and weeks that followed, I pored over books and websites, searching for any information on Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings in the Adirondacks. I found plenty of stories, some eerily similar to my own experience, but no concrete evidence, nothing to prove that what I'd seen was real. I've been back to those mountains since then. I tell myself it's because I love hiking, because I won't let one bad experience ruin my passion. But the truth is, I'm looking for it. Every time I set foot on a trail, part of me hopes and fears that I'll catch another glimpse of that impossible creature. Sometimes, when I'm deep in the woods and the shadows grow long, I think I hear heavy footsteps following me. A branch will snap in the distance, or I'll catch a whiff of that musky animal scent. And for a moment, my heart races, torn between terror and an inexplicable excitement. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that day. How could I? It goes against everything we think we know about the natural world. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I can't help but wonder, if one such creature exists, how many more might be out there, watching us from the shadows of the forest? So, if you find yourself hiking in the deep woods, and the forest suddenly goes quiet, pay attention. If you feel eyes on you or hear something large moving through the underbrush, don't dismiss it. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of what we think we know. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very unlucky, you might just catch a glimpse of them. Story 19. The creature's eyes locked onto ours as we sat trapped in the shallows, the tiny fishing boat suddenly feeling like a flimsy raft in the face of the impossible. I'm Jake Miller, and my brother Ryan and I have been fishing together since we were kids. We thought we knew every inch of Lake Champlain, but that day showed us how little we truly understood about the dark waters we'd grown up on. It was a crisp October morning when we set out, the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive. The lake was like glass, reflecting the autumn colors of the surrounding hills. We'd decided to try our luck in a remote cove on the western shore, a spot we'd heard whispers about at the local bait shop. Best bass fishing in the state, old Tom had said with a wink. If you don't mind a little company. We'd laughed it off at the time, assuming he meant other fishermen. If only we'd known. The trip out was uneventful. We chatted about nothing in particular: work, Ryan's kids, the upcoming hunting season. As we entered the cove, I cut the motor and we drifted in silence, taking in the beauty of the untouched shoreline. No docks, no cabins, just pristine wilderness. Man, it's quiet out here, Ryan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And it was. No bird song, no splash of fish, not even the rustle of wind through the trees. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. We cast our lines and settled in to wait. Hours passed with barely a nibble. The sun climbed high in the sky, and a light mist began to form on the water's surface. That's when we saw it. At first, I thought it was a log, or maybe a wayward buoy, but as I squinted against the glare, I realized it was moving, and it was big. "Ryan," I hissed, nudging my brother, "look over there. What is that?" He followed my gaze, his eyes widening. "I don't. Is that a person?" But we both knew it wasn't. It was too large, too wrong. As we watched, frozen in disbelief, the shape drew closer. That's when we got our first clear look. It emerged from the mist like something out of a nightmare. Bipedal, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a massive barrel-shaped chest covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging almost to the water's surface. But it was the face that sent ice through my veins. A blend of ape and man with deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, 2 shocked humans and 1 impossible creature. Then Ryan found his voice. "Start the motor," he whispered urgently. "We need to get out of here, now." I snapped out of my daze and lunged for the outboard, but in my haste, my hand slipped on the starter cord. I yanked it again, harder this time, and was rewarded with a sputtering cough from the engine. But it didn't catch. "Come on, come on," I muttered, pulling the cord again and again. Each time, the motor wheezed and died. Meanwhile, the creature was moving closer. It waded through the shallows with surprising grace, barely making a ripple. Those intelligent eyes never left us, filled with what I could only describe as curiosity and hunger. "Jake, it's getting closer." Ryan's voice was tight with fear. "We need to go." "I'm trying," I shouted, frustration and panic making my voice crack. I gave the cord one final desperate yank. The engine roared to life, then immediately died with a pathetic sputter. That's when I noticed the fuel gauge, empty. In our excitement to try this new spot, we'd forgotten to check the tank before setting out. We were stranded. The realization must have shown on my face, because Ryan's eyes widened in horror. "We're out of gas, aren't we?" he asked, already knowing the answer. I nodded grimly, my mind racing for options. We were too far from shore to swim, especially with that thing out there. Our only hope was to try to paddle to safety with the oars. "Grab an oar," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll make for that point over there. Maybe we can outpace it." Ryan nodded, his face pale but determined. We each seized an oar and began to paddle furiously, but our small boat, designed for stability rather than speed, moved agonizingly slowly through the water. The creature, seeming to sense our intention, let out a low, rumbling growl that sent shivers down my spine. It increased its pace, cutting through the water with powerful strokes. "Ah, it's gaining on us!" Ryan yelled, his voice tinged with panic. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing was barely 20 yards behind us now, and closing fast. I could see the muscles rippling under its wet fur, the flare of its nostrils as it scented the air. In desperation, I grabbed our tackle box and hurled it at the creature. It splashed into the water just in front of it, startling it momentarily. But it quickly regained its composure and pressed on, now with an air of annoyance added to its determined pursuit. We were nearing the point now, but I knew we wouldn't make it in time. The water was getting shallower, slowing our already sluggish progress, and then, with a sickening lurch, we ran aground. The boat scraped to a halt on a hidden sandbar, mere yards from the safety of the shore. We were stuck fast, the keel buried in the soft lake bottom. "We have to swim for it," Ryan said, already moving to climb overboard. But before either of us could make a move, a massive, hair-covered arm shot out of the water and grasped the side of our boat. The entire vessel shuddered under the creature's strength. Slowly, inevitably, it pulled itself up until its upper body loomed over us. This close, I could smell its musky animal odor, see the water dripping from its matted fur. Its breath came in heavy pants, surprisingly human-like. For what felt like an eternity, it simply stared at us, its head cocked to one side as if trying to figure out what exactly we were. I was certain that at any moment it would reach out and tear us limb from limb, but then something extraordinary happened. It reached into the boat, its movements almost gentle, and picked up one of our fishing rods. It turned the rod over in its massive hands, examining it with what I could only describe as curiosity. After a moment, it set the rod down and reached for our bait bucket. It sniffed at the contents, then to our amazement selected a worm and popped it into its mouth. A look that could almost be described as pleasure crossed its face. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature seemed to lose interest in us. It gave one final, penetrating look, let out a low grunt, and slipped back into the water. We watched in stunned silence as it swam away, eventually disappearing into the mist. For several minutes after it vanished, Ryan and I sat in shocked silence, struggling to process what we'd just experienced. Finally, Ryan broke the spell. Did that really just happen?" he asked, his voice shaky. I nodded slowly, still staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. "Yeah, I think it did." We managed to push the boat off the sandbar and paddle back to the boat launch, our fishing forgotten. The ride home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We never told anyone about what we saw that day. Who would believe us? But we've been back to that cove many times since, always with a mix of fear and hope. We've never seen the creature again, But sometimes, when the mist rolls in and the lake goes quiet, I swear I can feel eyes watching us from beneath the surface. That day changed how I see the world. It showed me that there are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation. And it taught me that sometimes the line between predator and curious observer is thinner than we might think. So if you're ever out on Lake Champlain and you see something strange in the mist, remember our story, and maybe, just maybe, bring an extra worm or two. You never know who or what might be hungry out there in the deep. Story 20. The massive footprint in the mud couldn't belong to any known animal. As I crouched there, casting the plaster, I had no idea that by nightfall I'd be hiding in my tent, listening to the heavy breathing of something impossibly large just outside. My name is Dr. Karen Matthews, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large mammal behavior. I've spent the last decade tracking and studying animals across North America, from grizzlies in Alaska to panthers in Florida. But nothing in my years of field experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the remote wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula. It was early June, and I'd been in the field for about a week. The Olympic National Park had reported an unusual spike in elk deaths, and I'd been called in to investigate. Initially, we'd suspected a particularly aggressive cougar or perhaps a small pack of wolves that had migrated into the area. But as I examined the kill sites, I began to notice inconsistencies. The carcasses were torn apart with a strength that seemed beyond any known predator in the region. And then there were the tracks. Massive, humanoid prints that dwarfed anything I'd ever seen. At first, I dismissed them as elaborate hoaxes, probably the work of local Bigfoot enthusiasts. But as I found more and more of them, always near fresh kill sites, a tiny seed of doubt began to grow in my mind. That morning, I'd set out at dawn, following a tip from a park ranger about another elk carcass found deep in the backcountry. The hike was grueling, taking me through dense old-growth forest and over rugged terrain. By midday, I'd reached the location. The scene was gruesome. The elk had been torn apart, its ribcage splayed open and limbs scattered across the forest floor. As I documented the site, taking photos and samples, I noticed a clear set of tracks leading away from the carcass. My heart raced as I examined them. They were similar to the others I'd seen, but these were the clearest yet, over 15 inches long, with distinct toe impressions, and a depth that suggested something of immense weight. I knew I had to document this properly. I took out my plaster casting kit and began to mix the solution, my hands shaking slightly with excitement and a touch of fear. As I poured the plaster into the print, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest had gone eerily quiet, with none of the usual bird calls or rustling of small animals. Just as I finished smoothing the surface of the cast, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing but dense undergrowth. Still, the sense of being observed intensified. I quickly packed up my gear, leaving the cast to set, and hurried back to my campsite, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully as I analyzed my samples and updated my field notes. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, that feeling of unease returned. I built up my campfire, hoping the light and smoke would deter any curious wildlife. As full dark settled in, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It seemed to come from just beyond the ring of firelight, too deep to be a cougar, too guttural for a bear. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam catching a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any known predator in these woods. My scientific curiosity warred with my instinct for self-preservation. Part of me wanted to grab my camera, to finally capture proof of whatever this creature was. But a more primal part of my brain screamed at me to seek shelter. I retreated to my tent, zipping it up tight and clutching my satellite phone. But who would I even call? What would I say? That I was being stalked by an unknown animal that might be the subject of countless Northwest legends. Throughout the night, I could hear it moving around my camp. Heavy footsteps circled my tent, accompanied by deep, huffing breaths and occasional low vocalizations that sounded almost like words, but in no language I could recognize. At one point, I heard the distinct sound of my equipment being rummaged through. Jars clinked, and I winced at the sound of something, my laptop, being crushed. I held my breath, certain that at any moment the creature would turn its attention to my flimsy nylon tent. But it never did. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the sounds gradually faded away. It wasn't until the forest came alive with morning birdsong that I finally dared to unzip my tent and peer out. The scene that greeted me was one of controlled chaos. My campsite looked as though it had been hit by a small tornado. Equipment was strewn everywhere, sample jars smashed, my laptop indeed crushed beyond repair. But most disturbing of all were the footprints. Massive, unmistakable impressions in the soft earth, identical to the one I'd cast the day before. With shaking hands, I took photos and measurements, my scientific training kicking in despite my fear. The prints averaged 17 inches in length, with a stride that suggested a creature well over 8 feet tall. As I followed the trail of destruction, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on the bark of several trees, well above my head height. I collected samples of the hair, securing them carefully in evidence bags. My mind raced with the implications of what I'd experienced. If this was real, and the physical evidence certainly suggested it was, it would turn the scientific community on its head. A previously undiscovered large primate species, right here in the continental United States. It seemed impossible. But as I surveyed the destroyed campsite and recalled the terrifying sounds of the night before, I knew that I'd encountered something beyond the realm of current scientific understanding. The question was, what should I do with this information? Part of me wanted to shout it from the rooftops, to call in every scientist and researcher I knew to comb these woods. But another part, the part that had cowered in my tent listening to that creature's guttural almost speech, urged caution. What would happen to this creature, or creatures, if their existence became widely known? Would they be hunted, captured for study, driven from their habitat by curiosity seekers and self-styled monster hunters? In the end, I packed up what remained of my equipment and hiked out of the backcountry. I told the park rangers that I'd had an encounter with a particularly aggressive black bear, explaining away the destruction of my camp. The footprint cast, the hair samples, and my hastily scribbled notes were securely stored in my backpack. Back in civilization, I spent weeks analyzing the samples. The hairs were unlike anything in our databases, similar in some ways to known great apes, but distinct enough to suggest a new species. The footprint cast, when compared to my photos and measurements, clearly showed a foot structure adapted for bipedal walking, but with a size and shape unlike any known primate. I wrote up my findings, documenting everything in meticulous detail. But when it came time to submit for peer review and publication, I hesitated. The rational, scientific part of my mind argued that this discovery was too important to keep secret. But I couldn't shake the memory of that night in the tent, the sense of an intelligence behind those growls and movements. In the end, I decided to sit on my findings, at least for the time being. I told myself it was to gather more evidence, to build an ironclad case before going public. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I felt a strange sense of responsibility toward the creature I'd encountered, a desire to protect it from the world's prying eyes. I've been back to the Olympic Peninsula several times since that night. I've never had another direct encounter. But sometimes, When I'm deep in the wilderness and the shadows grow long, I feel eyes watching me from the darkness. I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze, or hear a twig snap with a weight that no known animal could produce. And in those moments, I'm reminded that the world is bigger and more mysterious than we can imagine. There are things out there, creatures that defy our understanding, living just beyond the edge of our awareness. My encounter taught me humility in the face of the unknown, and a deep respect for the secrets the wilderness still holds. So if you find yourself in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, and you feel a prickling on the back of your neck like you're being watched, remember my story. You might just be in the presence of something extraordinary. And if you are, I hope you'll do as I did. Observe, document, but ultimately let it remain wild and free. Story 21. The elk carcass lay before me, ripped apart with a savagery I'd never seen in my 20 years of hunting. As I crouched there, examining the scene, a low growl emanated from the dense undergrowth. In that moment, I realized I was no longer the predator, but the prey. My name is David Hawkins, and I've been hunting in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but that day showed me how little I truly understood about the wilderness I'd called my second home. It was early October, the air crisp with the promise of winter. I'd set out before dawn, hoping to bag an elk to fill my freezer for the coming months. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the pines and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I'd been tracking a bull elk for the better part of the morning, following its trail deeper into a remote valley I'd never explored before. The terrain was rugged, with steep slopes and dense underbrush that made progress slow and arduous. But I was in no hurry, savoring the solitude and the thrill of the hunt. It was just past noon when I found the first sign that something was amiss. A set of tracks in a muddy patch caught my eye, not because they were unusual, but because they abruptly ended. It was as if the elk had simply vanished mid-stride. Puzzled, I scanned the area, looking for signs of where it might have gone. That's when I saw it, a splash of red against the brown forest floor, partially hidden by a fallen log. My heart quickened as I approached, expecting to find my quarry. But what I discovered sent a chill down my spine. The elk lay in a crumpled heap, its massive body torn open from sternum to pelvis. But this was no clean kill. The animal had been literally ripped apart, its limbs wrenched from their sockets with incredible force. Ribs protruded from the mangled flesh, and the ground was saturated with blood. I'd seen plenty of predator kills in my time, bears, cougars, even the occasional wolf pack. But this was something else entirely. The sheer violence of the attack was beyond anything I'd ever encountered. As I examined the carcass, my mind raced. What could have done this? A grizzly. But they weren't supposed to be in this part of the state, and even a full-grown grizzly would have been hard-pressed to inflict this kind of damage. I was so engrossed in my examination that I almost missed the sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my hand instinctively tightening on my rifle. Slowly, I straightened up, scanning the tree line. The forest had gone eerily quiet, with none of the usual bird song or chatter of squirrels. It was as if the whole woods were holding its breath. Another growl, closer this time. I raised my rifle, turning slowly on the spot. The undergrowth was thick, obscuring my view. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was circling me. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping to scare it off. "Get out of here!" My voice echoed through the trees, but the only response was another growl, this one so deep I could feel it vibrating in my chest. And then I saw them, two eyes, reflecting the afternoon light, set high in the brush, too high to be a bear or a cougar. For a moment, we stared at each other, me and this unknown creature. I could make out a vague shape now, a hulking silhouette that stood easily 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, matted fur, with shoulders so broad they seemed to span the width of an old-growth pine. My finger tightened on the trigger, but I hesitated. In all my years of hunting, I'd never encountered anything like this. Was it some kind of undiscovered species, a bear with a rare genetic mutation, or could it be... But no, that was impossible. Those were just stories, campfire tales to scare tourists. The creature shifted, and I caught a glimpse of its face. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with a heavy brow and a jaw that jutted forward aggressively. But it was the eyes that truly shook me. They weren't the dull, animal eyes I was used to seeing. There was an intelligence there, a spark of something almost human. For what felt like an eternity, we remained locked in this standoff. My arms began to shake from the strain of holding the rifle at the ready. Sweat trickled down my back despite the cool air. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the undergrowth. I heard the crash of vegetation as it moved away, far more quietly than something of its size should have been able to. I stood there for several minutes, straining my ears for any sound of its return. But the forest remained silent, as if the whole encounter had been some sort of fever dream. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in. I needed to get out of there, to get back to my truck and civilization. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A tuft of coarse, dark hair snagged on a low-hanging branch. Without thinking, I reached out and plucked it free. It was unlike any animal fur I'd ever seen, thick and wiry, almost like human hair. But not quite. I carefully tucked it into my pocket, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd just experienced. The hike back to my truck was a blur. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I kept expecting to see that hulking shape emerge from the trees, those two intelligent eyes fixed on me, but I made it back without incident, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove home, my mind raced with questions. What had I seen out there? Could it really be the creature of legend, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it? And if it was, what should I do with this information? Part of me wanted to report it, to call in experts and mount an expedition to find proof. This could be the scientific discovery of the century. But another part, the part that had looked into those eyes and seen something more than animal, urged caution. What would happen to the creature if its existence was proven? Would it be hunted, captured, driven from its home by curiosity seekers and self-styled monster hunters? In the end, I decided to keep quiet, at least for the time being. I told my wife I'd had a close encounter with a bear, explaining away my shaken demeanor. The tuft of hair I'd collected went into a small box in my desk drawer, a secret reminder of what I'd experienced. I've been back to those woods many times since that day. I still hunt, still track elk through the quiet forests, but now I do it with a newfound respect for the wilderness and its secrets. Sometimes, when I'm deep in the backcountry and the shadows grow long, I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze, or I'll hear a twig snap with a weight that no known animal could produce. And in those moments, I'm reminded that there are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that lurk just at the edge of our awareness, watching us even as we think we're the ones doing the observing. I don't know if I'll ever see that creature again. Part of me hopes I do, while another part dreads the possibility. But one thing's for certain, my encounter changed the way I see the world. It taught me humility in the face of the unknown, and a deep respect for the mysteries that still exist in our supposedly tamed wilderness. So if you find yourself in the deep woods and you feel that prickling sensation on the back of your neck like you're being watched, remember my story. You might just be in the presence of something extraordinary. And if you are, I hope you'll do as I did, observe, wonder, but ultimately let it remain wild and free. For some secrets, I've learned, are best left undiscovered. Story 22. The headlights caught a pair of glowing eyes, but they were too high off the ground to be a deer. As the massive, fur-covered figure stepped into view, I realized this lonely forest road was about to become my personal hell. My name is Amanda Reeves, and I'm a long-haul trucker. I've driven across this country more times than I can count, seen all kinds of strange things on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonless night in the backwoods of Northern California. It was late October, and I was making a run from Seattle to Los Angeles. I'd decided to take a scenic route through the Shasta Trinity National Forest, figuring I could enjoy the fall colors and avoid the monotony of the interstate. As night fell, a light drizzle began to fall, making the winding forest road slick and treacherous. I'd been driving for hours, the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the low hum of the engine lulling me into a sort of trance. The forest pressed in close on both sides of the road, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of darkness broken only by my headlights. I was looking forward to reaching the next town, where I planned to stop for coffee and a much-needed break. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, a trick of the light on the wet road. But as I drew closer, I realized there was something standing at the edge of the pavement. Something big. I slowed down, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. Two eyes glowed in the reflection of my headlights, but they were set far too high to be a deer or even a bear. As I watched, transfixed, a massive figure stepped out onto the road. My foot slammed on the brake instinctively. The truck's tires screeched on the wet asphalt, and I felt the trailer start to jackknife behind me. I fought the wheel, trying desperately to keep control as the world spun around me. With a sickening lurch, the truck slid off the road. I felt a bone-jarring impact as the cab smashed into a tree, and then everything went black. I'm not sure how long I was out. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The engine had died, and the only sound was the soft patter of rain on the roof of the cab. My head throbbed, and I could taste blood where I'd bitten my lip during the crash. Gingerly, I took stock of my situation. The truck was tilted at an odd angle, the driver's side door pressed up against a massive pine tree. I tried my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising in these remote woods. That's when I remembered what had caused me to crash in the first place. With a surge of fear, I peered out the cracked windshield. The road was empty. No sign of the creature I'd seen. Had I imagined it? Was it just fatigue playing tricks on my mind? But then I saw it. Moving through the trees on the other side of the road was a massive, shadowy figure. It was easily 8 feet tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. In the dim light, I could make out shaggy fur covering its entire body. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, it turned its head towards the truck. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It took a step towards me, then another. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of here, had to find help, but the driver's side door was pinned shut by the tree. I clambered over to the passenger side, my hands shaking as I fought with the door handle. The door swung open with a creak that seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet forest. I tumbled out, my legs weak and shaky. The cold rain soaked through my clothes immediately, but I hardly noticed. My entire focus was on the creature, which had now reached the edge of the road. It stood there, eerily still, watching me. In the faint moonlight that now filtered through the clouds, I could make out more details. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with a heavy brow and a protruding jaw. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. There was an intelligence there, a spark of something almost human. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I was frozen in place, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, these were campfire stories, not flesh and blood creatures standing on dark forest roads. The creature took another step forward, and the spell was broken. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the wet leaves that covered the forest floor. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush. Its footsteps were surprisingly quiet for something so large, but I could sense its presence, feel its eyes on my back as I fled. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was gaining on me, moving through the forest with a grace that belied its size. In my panic, I didn't see the root jutting up from the ground. My foot caught, and I went sprawling, landing hard on the wet earth. Pain shot through my ankle, and I knew in that moment that I was done for. I rolled over, expecting to see the creature looming over me, but to my surprise, it had stopped a few yards away. It stood there watching me with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Slowly, it sank into a crouch, its massive hands resting on its knees. It made a sound then, a low, rumbling vocalization that was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't quite speech, but it didn't sound like any animal call I knew either. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Me, sprawled on the forest floor with a throbbing ankle, and this impossible creature crouched just out of reach. The rain had stopped, and in the silence, I could hear its breathing deep and steady. Gradually, my fear began to ebb, replaced by a sort of wonder. This thing, whatever it was, could have easily overpowered me, but it hadn't. Instead, it seemed almost curious. Slowly telegraphing my movements, I sat up. The creature tensed, but didn't move. I held out my hands, palms up, in what I hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I won't hurt you," I said softly, feeling a bit foolish for talking to it like it could understand. But to my amazement, it responded. It mimicked my gesture, holding out one massive, hair-covered hand, palm up. For a wild moment, I considered touching it, making contact with this creature that shouldn't exist. But before I could move, a sound broke the silence, the distant wail of a siren. The creature's head snapped up, alert. It looked at me one last time, those eyes seeming to bore into my soul. Then, with a grace that still astounds me, it turned and melted into the forest, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. Moments later, a state trooper found me, alerted by a passing motorist who had seen my crashed truck. I was taken to a hospital, treated for a sprained ankle and mild concussion. When asked what had happened, I mumbled something about swerving to avoid a deer. In the days and weeks that followed, I questioned everything about that night. Had it really happened, or was it just a hallucination brought on by the crash? But every time I close my eyes, I can still see those intelligent eyes staring into mine. I can still feel the mix of fear and wonder I experienced in those woods. I've driven that route many times since then. Sometimes, when the moon is hidden and the forest is dark, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the tree line. A shadow that's too large to be a bear, a pair of eyes that gleam with an unsettling intelligence. And in those moments, I'm reminded that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than we can imagine. There are things out there, creatures that defy our understanding, living just beyond the edges of our civilization. So if you find yourself driving down a lonely forest road late at night, and you see something that doesn't quite fit, remember my story. You might just be in the presence of something extraordinary. And if you are, I hope you'll do as I did. Observe, wonder, and ultimately, let it remain wild and free. For some encounters, I've learned, are best left as mysteries.